Can find their seat at the table in the audience. Find a comfortable seat. We shall begin in just a minute or two. Great to see so many people here. I'd like to welcome the DPIIC members, DPIIC agency staff, stakeholders, and participants. It's an honor to call to order this meeting of the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee. We first met in April of 2014. Since then, we have convened this group approximately every 6 months. This committee has been a valuable forum for discussion of best available science and priority management actions. It is additionally becoming an increasingly useful venue for each of the agencies to hear an update on the many collaborative actions that are intended to improve statewide water supply reliability and ecosystem conditions in the Delta. Some of you have been here for each of the previous 5 meetings. I want to express my appreciation for the cooperation and successes that have been realized since our committee's inception. Progress has been realized because 17 state and federal agency leaders have found matters to agree upon and directed your respective staff members to work collectively and cooperatively. Some of you are here for the first time. The committee you are now a part of plays a unique and important role in increasing the level of cooperation between federal, state, and local agencies on priority actions in the Delta. The committee is called out in the Delta Reform Act, described in the Delta Plan, and is specifically highlighted in the Governor's California Water Action Plan. This is one of the few venues that exist to help further the sustainable management of the Delta by creating a public dialogue about the various initiatives and, in particular, discussing new opportunities for coordinated state and federal interagency action in the Delta. In the words of one of our colleagues, who will remain unmentioned, this is the best game in town. We ought to double down. Right, Mark? It is an honor to have all of you here, and I look forward to our discussions today. Before I describe today's agenda and offer my thoughts about potential outcomes, it's important to acknowledge last Tuesday's election results will have implications for the work we do in the Delta. We will soon be working with a new administration in Washington, D.C. And while uncertainty reigns, the one thing that is certain is that the new administration can benefit from our collective knowledge and experience in the Delta. I hope that we can use this meeting to find agreement to collectively work on a couple of big ideas that cannot be done or addressed by any single state or federal agency. This committee has a track record of success. When faced with successive years of drought, you agreed to appoint one of your agency's high-level representatives to serve on a work group to identify high-impact, near-term science needs. The Delta Agency's Science Work Group identified gaps in our science understanding that were not currently being addressed. The proposed short list of actions that were developed and endorsed by this committee has produced usable results. I hope we can build on that level of cooperation and the good results today by selecting more initiatives to endorse as a committee. Today you will hear about recent significant successes, including new ideas regarding how to better support and improve collaborative science and management efforts, which we discovered at the Science Enterprise Workshop less than 2 weeks ago. That has great potential for improving the way we manage, fund, and communicate science. You will hear progress reports on EcoRestore and the Yellow Bypass Partnership planning and projects, with a challenge to you to intensify efforts to assist with permitting and implementation of the EcoRestore projects. You will hear about major breakthroughs in scientific understanding of the Delta, and hopefully a discussion will follow about how DPIIC agencies can assist with achieving a sustainable future for the Delta. The aim for today's DPIIC meeting is to provide each of you an opportunity to describe your agency's work related to Delta matters and the current challenges and successes that you are focused on, and to provide opportunities throughout this meeting to interact with one another. I want to encourage you to ask each other questions as the meeting unfolds. In response to information provided during each agenda item, we want to encourage discussion that leads to identifying opportunities, how to make real progress, and endorsement for meaningful actions. Before we begin receiving the presentations listed on today's agenda, I would like to go around the table and ask each of you to do two things. Actually three things. One, introduce yourselves. Two, share with us what you would like to get out of this meeting. And finally, share any significant accomplishments or challenges that your agency is dealing with, particularly those since we last met in May. So with that, I will call on my esteemed lead scientist colleague, Dr. Cliff Daum, to begin the introductions around the table.
Okay, number one, introduction. I'm Cliff Daum. I'm the lead scientist for the Delta Science Program. What do I hope to get out of this meeting? I'd love to have the group here settle on a couple actions that we might take that are related to some of the very science-focused themes that we're going to be hearing about today. We're going to be learning about the Science Enterprise Workshop. We're going to be learning about two reports that have just been issued today. One on summary of Bay Delta, summary of the state of Bay Delta science that's been put together for policymakers, and then also the Delta Renewed. And then you'll also hear about some progress that's being made in the ecosystem restoration field associated with EcoRestore. So I wanted to add to what Randy has just said about the agenda. I wanted to just highlight three other items that are occurring that are focused on science in the Delta. The reason we're meeting here today in the Convention Center is that tomorrow starts the Bay Delta Science Conference. This is a biennial science conference that has occurred now. This will be the 9th time, so it's been going on for 16 years, and it has basically a large number of science, policymakers, engineers come together to discuss a variety of different science topics. This meeting is going to, again, I think be highly successful. There are about 1,100 people registered to attend. There's going to be about 250 talks. There's going to be 28 special sessions. There's going to be 150 posters. There's going to be a plenary session tomorrow morning that includes at least one of our DPIIC members as a plenary speaker. And I think this meeting really shows the robustness of science in the Delta. You don't get 1,000+ people to come to a 3-day science conference every other year unless there's a lot of interest in science and a lot of science being done. Second thing I wanted to highlight is there's a lot of interest in modeling, and modeling that involves multiple agencies and different types of models that range all the way from global climate change models down to food web models of specific organisms living in the Delta. This idea of modeling was, I think, we had an interesting symposium that was held in 2015. The title of it was Integrated Modeling for Adaptive Management of Estuarine Ecosystems. You're going to hear today about the Science Enterprise Workshop. Modeling is going to be another theme that it's going to come out of this. And I wanted to let you know that there also will be a summary of the earlier symposium that will be focused for policymakers that should be issued shortly, and I'll be sharing that with you. The third thing I also wanted to highlight is that back in 2015 in July, we had another symposium and workshop. It was called Enhancing the Vision for Managing California's Environmental Information. That generated a report that was called Enhancing the Vision for Managing California's Environmental Information with a variety of different recommendations. Some of those recommendations have now been acted upon. The passage of AB 1755, the Open and Transparent Water Data Act, that was signed into law on September 23rd of this year, is now going to put us on a path to doing some of the things that this vision paper suggested we do, and DWR, Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the State Water Resources Control Board are going to be lead agencies in making this happen. So just wanted to highlight that sometimes we can go from science conferences to reports to action, and here's a nice example of that. So with that, I'll turn it back over to the chair.
Great. Cliff, thank you. Let's just proceed around the table. Michelle?
Well, I think my statement will be relatively short. My name is Michelle Bononis. I'm the area manager for the Bay Delta office with the Bureau of Reclamation. I think what I hope to get out of the discussion today is mainly taking concepts that were learned in the Science Enterprise workshop that was presented, which was a great workshop. I was there at the beginning and the tail end, and it seems like the lessons learned were very valuable. Taking those concepts and basically discussing a little bit more about the practical application of those concepts and how we actually utilize those in our day-to-day decision-making processes. Just some general challenges. Of course, we're planning for Water Year 2017. We're starting to have those discussions. I think, just generally speaking, as an agency, we are constantly working with ways to deal with operations in the context of drought, water needs, species needs, and then, of course, impending major decisions and shifts related to regulatory structure or decisions that are forthcoming, maybe, for example, on water fix, water quality control plan amendments, and reinitiation of consultation, and I will just leave it there. So, thank you.
Good afternoon. I am Mary Pifo. I serve as chair of the Delta Protection Commission. I also serve as a member of the Board of Supervisors in Contra Costa County. Happy to be here representing in Delta interests. Happy to share what we're doing at the Delta Protection Commission, which we'll do in a moment. What I'd like to get out of today is how we are really using science, the history of science, the depth and breadth of science in all that we are doing as it relates to Delta activities, including California Water Fix. I was certainly interested in hearing more about that. Accomplishments and challenges. Those of us that know water in this state, we know the challenges. The challenge, one of them, the biggest one, is probably gaining accomplishments. At the Delta Protection Commission in particular, we're working on the Delta Flood Risk Levee Assessment District Feasibility Study. We had a presentation at our October meeting from our consultants. As you can imagine, you try to solve one problem and there become all sorts of other issues and challenges associated with it, particularly impacts from identifying beneficiaries, Proposition 218 constraints and requirements, et cetera, et cetera. But it's something that the Delta Protection Commission is working on and working through resolving, and the next month that will be on the agenda is January of 2017. We also will be moderating, the DPC will be moderating a panel at the Bay Area Science Conference this Thursday, and Supervisor Skip Thompson, Vice Chair of the Delta Protection Commission, will be the moderator of that event on my behalf, because I will be sitting with Chairman Fiorini and my colleagues on the Delta Stewardship Council at our Delta Stewardship Council meeting this Thursday. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Good afternoon. My name is Tomas Torres, and I am the Director of Water Division at US EPA in San Francisco. I hope to learn a lot from this session, and this is my first meeting here of the DPIIC, and I look forward to learning a lot and seeing where EPA can contribute and be supportive and helpful. Let's see, I think one of the main goals that we're interested in is in how we can use the Clean Water Act to support the goals of the Delta, whether it's the water quantity sustainability, as well as the water quality and beneficial uses for the Delta. And so my staff are here to support the conference that's taking place in the next few days, and we look forward to continuing to partner with you.
Hey, my name's Chuck Bonham. I'm the director of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. The thing I hope to get from this meeting, Randy, is whether the committee may reach consensus on a next set of actions or kind of directions it may like to take together. And all the updates I would have look like they're going to be covered under Agenda Item 4 by Carl Wilcox, Chris Chernell, and David Okita. I will summarize that agenda item, though, with this takeaway. By our calculation, in the last 18 months since the governor announced Cal Eco Restore, we've done as much restoration in the Delta as had been done in the prior 20 years combined.
Yeah, it's a remarkable progress. Mark, can you beat that?
We helped. Hi, I'm Mark Cowan, Director of California's Department of Water Resources. I think in high-level terms, I would echo what Michelle already said. I hope to continue to refine and be more specific about how we develop and implement a science agenda, how we fund and conduct science, and ultimately how we incorporate the best science into our decision-making. So it's easy to say in broad terms, harder to do specifically. So I appreciate the specific agenda items you bring forward in this committee so that we can make incremental progress towards those lofty goals. Just in terms of what's on my mind relative to current events, I suppose the fact that it's now mid-November, we've entered another water year, which means all the same questions that we've faced for the past 5 or more water years in terms of what this winter will produce and what we're going to do about it in terms of not only state and federal project operations, but managing water for all its beneficial uses across the state. And who knows, Bill, maybe we'll even have a flood year and we can finally dust off some of our flood plans and start considering how we're doing on that score as well. Anyway, we have worked well together, I believe, over the last many years now of drought. I think we've learned a lot, and hopefully we can do even better with limited resources if we're put to the test again this year. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Randy. My name is... Oh, I'm sorry.
Good afternoon, Bill.
Hi, Bill. That's all right, quite all right. Good afternoon. I'm Campbell Ingram. I'm the Executive Officer of the Delta Conservancy. My hope for the meeting is that we all get a clear sense of how planning, adaptive management, science, and implementation are all sort of coming together currently and how we see that projecting into the future. I think it's really important that we all kind of share that vision as we are working away at these different pieces and understand how they fit together. So I think you'll see some really interesting information today, and it'll create a good picture of how that's all working together. And I think as far as updates go, I'm on the agenda a little bit later as part of item number 4, so I'll provide more updates on our specific activities at that point. Thanks.
Thanks, Campbell. Good afternoon, Bill.
Good afternoon, Randy. Sorry, Campbell. When Mark talked about flood, it got my interest up real quick. I'm Bill Edgar. I'm president of the State Flood Board. And Randy, what I'd like to get out of this meeting today is a better understanding of how all of these planning efforts that are coming to conclusion, or at least milestones, are all going to fit together. And I think that's important for all of us. What's on my mind today, as many of you know, there are many folks in this area and in your agencies that are working together to try to remove impediments from implementation. We've been working in this area for some time and trying to reconcile the conflicting values, and have been, I think, reasonably successful. Our flood plan was adopted as a result of a lot of collaboration and so on. Probably significant to point out that it's the only plan we have that's not under litigation at this point, I believe. So in any event, the other area that we've been able to see some work and success in reconciling different values is during the last couple of years on the update, the 2017 update of the flood plan, wherein we've been seeing a lot of those problems between system-wide recommended improvements and regional, local improvements being reconciled at this point, and I think that's been a sign of the governor's attempt to get us all to work together. And the third point is I should say, has been kind of a success that's come up recently, and that is, probably some of you know, pursuant to the adoption of the flood plan in 2012, there was a section in the resolution that told us to establish an advisory committee to try and the point of the committee would be to provide guidance to the flood board regarding and recommendations related to statements that would be included in the flood plan update and the conservation strategy of the plan that's coming up in a few months, and try to ensure that the approach to multi-benefit ecosystem restoration is functional, it's implementable, and it has broad support by all the stakeholders and communities. And that committee was convened. It was a 3-month effort, supposed to be, lasted as it normally does over a period of time, and I think it was a total of a year. But their report was presented to the flood board last month. And in that report, there are a couple of highlights from the advisory committee's recommendations as it relates to permitting, stakeholder collaboration, and large-scale restoration efforts. And that report is now posted on the website. And the highlights basically are, after over a year, the stakeholders have concluded that although there seems to be conflict from multi-stakeholders, but it seems to be a lot of it has to do with perception. And once you're able to clear up disagreements and work together, you can resolve some of those issues. And with regard to the advisory committee's scope, the objective of the committee was to advise the board on the development of these long-term statewide conservation objectives. With the need to permitting, there was a concern upon the part of most of the people that the one area that remained in which there was a lot of concern was the operation and maintenance of the system on an ongoing basis. How could we make that process more efficient as we moved along? And finally, the committee concluded that, the effort that we went through, and it took over a year to provide an open forum for everybody involved, seemed to be a good approach that was successful. There were 4 outcomes of that committee that related to permitting, system-wide permitting, and one of them was to use, if we could, large-scale permitting efforts to bundle projects together to maximize benefits. That is, that in our update of the flood plan, we need to consider the need for permitting of management actions at the regional, interregional, and system scale to allow the projects in different parts of the geographical area to be linked in these bundles so that we could get multi-benefits from the entire project. And we think that the use of larger spatial scale of permitting framework may support more permitting efficiency and allow better achievement of the goals. The board addressed also, the board has the need for a viable process for long-term operation and maintenance, and the committee was recommending that the flood board consider that for not this update 217, but to come up with a specific process for the update in 2022. The third highlight was to increase the coordination, consider the need for coordination between local, state, federal permitting and regulatory processes, agencies to ensure that the regulatory requirements imposed during the permitting process don't impede others or conflict with other ideas. And finally, the innovative permitting approaches need to be looked at, and there needs to be an effort to look at other agencies, other cities, and other parts of the country to see if there's better ways to do permitting than maybe we've tried or not done before. But that committee was made up of about 30 people. It's a committee that I think looked into some of these issues on trying to implement multi-benefit projects and trying to remove impediments that have been pointed out time and again at this DPIIC meeting. So I think the report's worth looking at. It was presented to the board at our last meeting. It's available on the website. It's fairly short. It's worth reading, and of course the tape of the meeting was there, so you can see the kind of level of support that we garnered. But I think this is all by way of saying there are a lot of efforts out there to try to work across the agencies, and this was one of them that just finished its work. Thanks, Randy.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Maria Ray. I'm the Assistant Regional Administrator for NOAA Fisheries, supervising the Central Valley office. I want to acknowledge in the audience our new Regional Administrator, Barry Thom, is here. He has to leave for Southern California later today, but is able to join the meeting from the seats here for a bit, and welcome him to these discussions in DPIIC. In terms of expectations today, I'm really happy to see the continued focus on science and building bridges on science. I was able to participate in the Science Enterprise workshop, so many thanks to you, Randy, your staff, USGS for leading that workshop. I think it was very successful in bringing together folks who are really working on how to create science strategies and manage science as opposed to just doing the science, and really think about how to take the kind of science that we're going to all be exposed to in the Delta Science Conference coming up and make that meaningful for managers, bridge that gap between doing science and decision making, which I think is really what is challenging, easy to say and hard to do. So I'm really interested in that topic. We as NOAA Fisheries are one of the consumers of the science as we look at that and form our opinions and biological opinions under the Endangered Species Act. There are many challenges of that, but one of the accomplishments I'd highlight is that with a lot of hard work with the Bureau of Reclamation, so Michelle, I want to give you folks credit, we were able to, at Shasta Reservoir this last summer, maintain temperatures for winter run Chinook. And we released that information publicly last week. I think it was well documented in the clip. So happy to actually share some successes after 2 years of failures with that species. And again, just very challenging to manage for salmon conditions during drought. And just to take that as a microcosm of science, I certainly wouldn't support intending to do an adaptive management experiments where you actually lose 2 cohorts of your species you're trying to manage for. But I will say that we did adapt really quickly to those conditions. We had brought new scientific tools to bear. We had new processes put in place. And we quickly assimilated new information about how sensitive species were to temperature tolerances in ways that we really hadn't anticipated. And a lot of that was with support of our Southwest Fisheries Science Center. And they will be presenting at the conference coming up. We've got a lot of papers and being put out by our Santa Cruz lab. And so they're not represented at this table, but they're very much supporting a lot of these adaptive management decisions. Also on the CSAMP process, I would just highlight that's the collaborative science process that we've put together around the biological opinions, and the salmon scoping team there has come out with its final report. And there are ongoing discussions about how to best prioritize a set of concrete, very discrete science actions coming out of that effort as well. So I think very timely to have this broader discussion and a lot of good work going on. Thanks.
Good afternoon. I'm Gordon Burns, the Undersecretary at Cal EPA. And I too am looking forward very much to the discussion of the enterprise workshop. And I went to part of it. There seemed to be a lot of great ideas there and a lot of energy. And hopefully we can identify some lessons that they've learned in the Chesapeake and the Everglades and some of these other big federal state projects and identify some that would benefit us. In terms of accomplishment, I'll go a little bit afield and highlight that in the next week or so, several state agencies, including the Water Board, are going to be releasing a report on how to do water conservation better, some fundamental changes in water conservation in California. This is in response to the governor's executive order issued to those agencies earlier this year to come up with recommendations on how to make conservation a California way of life, which is the first goal of the California Water Action Plan. Well, that doesn't so much directly affect the Delta, as we all know. All of these kinds of things, water conservation in particular, are examples of things that we need to do to make our water supply system more reliable and resilient.
So I'm Mark Sogi. I'm the Pacific Regional Director for U.S. Geological Survey. And in terms of recent activities, in addition to the portfolio of science that we conduct in the Delta in collaboration with many of the groups around the table, we're pleased to have helped co-host the Science Enterprises Workshop. And I'm very much looking forward today to hearing the recommendations that group's going to come forward with for us to consider. We also, as Maria said, have quite a few scientists at the Delta Science Conference this week, and we have been busy co-authoring some of the chapters in the State of the Bay Delta Science document that we're going to get an overview today. So in terms of things I'm looking to get from today, I'm really looking forward to hearing the synthesis or the summaries of the State of the Bay Delta Science, the Delta Renewed, and also hearing about the Delta Conservation Framework. Upcoming maybe challenges or activities, the one that I will highlight is something that you mentioned, Randy, with the administration transition that's coming up. The Department of Interior was expecting to have President-elect Trump's landing team arrive today in the Department of the Interior. We'll be spending time bringing them up to date on all of USGS science activities, but the San Francisco Bay Delta is one of about 24 that are being highlighted for folks within the administration and the water and science. So that's it.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Felicia Marcus, the chair of the State Water Resources Control Board. What I want to get out of today, inspiration and hope. Don't read into that. Inspiration and hope, and through progress on stuff, I would say. I'm looking forward to hearing about the amazing things that are happening on the ground, and equally pleased to see the progress in pulling together science into the One Delta science, but also making it accessible to decision makers that so many people have mentioned and so many people have labored on in this meeting. To me, that's a classic whole being greater than the sum of the parts. And I don't know if it makes my heart swell as much as seeing ecosystem restoration on speed. But the sense of progress and being in a room of people in the audience in this room and presumably on the web who are focused on trying to figure out how to get things done is the space I like to be in. So very happy to be here and not have to do a presentation other than answer your two questions. For the Water Board, it's been a busy time on a lot of fronts. Appreciate Gordon mentioning the executive order that we've been working on with the department, Fish and Wildlife, Fish and all of you guys. And somebody get me a cup of coffee. But with respect to Bay Delta, it feels very good for the Water Board to be back where we wanted to be pre-drought, where all of us were all hands on deck, and our update of the water quality control plan was delayed for 2 or 3 years. So probably I'd say the biggest three things happening since our last meeting are the September rollout of the draft, the reissue of a new draft of the Phase 1 Water Quality Control Plan update for the Lower San Joaquin and South Delta salinity standards. They've, of course, met with universal comprehension and universal acclaim. It's a joke. Only a few people are chuckling back there. But we're in it, and we're into conversations, and there are both understandable fears and reactions, but also a lot of hard work with people rolling up their sleeves and trying to figure out how to move that forward in a way that works for everyone. And we also released the draft scientific basis report for Phase 2, which is the Sacramento River, the Delta proper, and a whole bunch of things. Within that, it is out for draft review, including a specific review from the Delta Independent Science Board. We'll take that all in. We will be then revising it accordingly, and then it will go for blind peer review, which is our process. Then it will come back, and we will also be proposing a proposed update to those standards sometime next year, as early next year as we can, taking into consideration the science in those discussions. We'll be back in workshop mode December 7th on that scientific basis report. Many of you, including the Delta Council, were very instrumental in a series of workshops we did when we were first working on this a few years ago. So we expect you all to come back and be wise and help us come up with moving this. And also great thanks to the folks at Resources, Chuck and Carla, and a host of others who are helping try to pull people together to see if we can come up with some agreements that, again, make the whole greater than the sum of the parts. So a very exciting time to be focused back on Bay Delta, and a very exciting time to be able to do that in the context of all the good work that people are doing on the science and trying to pull it together in one large, perhaps complex, but not overly complicated effort to make some progress. The other thing, obviously, on the Delta that I can't really speak about, but should be mentioned because it's tremendously time intensive for a lot of the agencies here, but for us are the evidentiary hearings on the water rights change petition for the water fix process. If we ever talk about it, I have to leave the room, but that's also a big thing that the Water Board is fully engaged in up to our armpits right now. The other thing I'm hoping for this year, of course, is enough rain and snow to not flood anybody out or hurt them, but to ease some of the pain and the fear and the pressure so that we can really get into the dialogue about how we move forward in the 21st century. And it's just very difficult when people are in pain to be able to do that as thoughtfully as we might like to. So again, another reason why I'm happy to be in this room today.
My name is Paul Souza. My name is Paul Souza. I'm the new Regional Director for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Pacific Southwest region. Really excited to be a part of this team. I've been on the job now for about 3 months. I'm drinking from the fire hose, but I'm having a great time. It's just such a beautiful place to get to do conservation work, and I'm honored to have the chance to be here. I'm actually a Californian, so I grew up in Alameda, went to school in Santa Barbara, and then spent a couple of decades going back and forth between Florida and D.C. So to have the chance to come here and be a part of this team and do this kind of work is truly an honor. So far, my time has been focused a lot on big issues. The California water fix, of course, is a significant issue for us. I've been really excited to see the progress of the Delta Smelt Resiliency Strategy. Kudos to the state for its leadership on those important activities. You may have heard also we're reinitiating consultation on long-term operations. This is going to be a significant question for us. I'm really trying to figure out how we integrate the work that we're doing on the federal side with the important work of the board, as well as the other state efforts and local efforts that are underway. So for me, what I'd love to gain from this event is an understanding of the science that underpins all of these activities. And my challenge, speaking for myself, is so far I've been focused on issues rather than the big picture. And what I really want to be able to do is figure out how to be helpful in this broader enterprise of ecosystem restoration. The best ecosystem efforts are always grand compromises between the needs of people, agriculture, municipalities, and multi-species. And it's too easy to deal with the issue of the moment, the single species that's on the brink of extinction, and lose sight of the big picture. So I want to figure out how I can be helpful to make sure we're all being strategic and we're having those conversations about compromise so we all can get more than we could individually.
So I'll just say ditto to everything. My name is Karen Ross, and I'm Secretary of the California Department of Food and Agriculture. And I relish this because it is bringing all the science together. And we've already seen good results, and I'm optimistic about the results going forward. But I urge all of us to also think about that very important role of communicating the science to build trust throughout our very diverse stakeholder communities. And that can inform smarter investments or confidence in the investments that are being made, and I think can bring us longer lasting results if we marry the science that's informing the decision making and every step of the way being able to engage all of our stakeholders to come to agreement around that science if there is such a thing about that. The other thing that I'm most focused on, and I've already just thumbed through this and I love seeing all the ways that our farmers and ranchers as landowners have a very important and direct role in ecosystem restoration and really getting those multiple benefits. Today's farmers and ranchers very much know that healthy ecosystems mean healthy fish and healthy farming, and I truly believe that the science can help us make those kinds of adaptive management strategies in a changing climate that will help us all be successful together.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Thank you all. I realized last night when I was anticipating comments that I don't think I've ever provided you an update on activities of the Delta Stewardship Council. You heard from Cliff about the work of the Delta Science Program, so I wanted to highlight 4 matters that I would point to as successes from the Delta Stewardship Council's perspective. One is we were charged with helping the state design a priority of investments for Delta levees. We've been working with the Department of Water Resources, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the Central Valley Flood Protection Board. We're making progress towards that list of priorities and recommendations. You will hear in, I think it's file item number 4 on the Delta Conservation Framework. We've been working cooperatively with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to prepare those conservation measures that are no longer front and center from the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, with an eye towards amending them into the Delta Plan so that there's lasting value to those conservation measures. Covered actions, we have some authority in the Delta, and I'm pleased to tell you that there's been 4 or 5 restoration activities that have been certified as consistent with the Delta Plan. And we've worked with several state agencies on those. Additionally, and most recently, quite a success, I believe, in San Joaquin County. One of the recommendations, regulations in the Delta Plan is to provide for smart land use planning. And we were pleased that recently San Joaquin County Board of Supervisors took land use planning actions that were consistent with that Delta Plan. And finally, Delta View. It's a database that was created to assimilate status reports on all Delta-related projects and funding. As you recall, a year ago around this table, we had questions about the level of funding that's achieved in the Delta, and Delta View was an effort that has taken a couple of years, and with the cooperation of every agency around this table to compile all that information, and now it will be necessary for you all to help contribute to keep that updated to make it as meaningful a product as it can be. But we began to identify where the funding comes from and how much is going to individual projects, which now provides me a great segue to our agenda item number 2, the Science Enterprise Workshop. As Jessica Law and Mike Chotkowski come to the presenters table, I will remind you that at a meeting a year ago, there was questions raised about why is it that these other ecological areas, such as the Chesapeake, the Great Lakes, Louisiana coast, areas like that seem to attract more federal interest and funding, particularly for science, than we do here in the Delta. Well, that question led to, well, yeah, and we've got all these science activities. How do they all connect? So those two questions stimulated a response from the USGS. Mike Chotkowski contacted me the week after that November meeting and said, your question is a good one, but I'd like to expand upon that and then help you answer it. And so the question was morphed into how do these other areas around the country manage, fund, and communicate science? And being the great leader that I am, I accepted his great idea and said, go for it. And with Mike's leadership from USGS, assimilating experts from around the country, and Jessica Law, our interagency coordinator, together they planned and executed an event that many people commented to me, it's the best 2 days that they have spent in a long, long time. So Jessica, Mike, we look forward to hearing what I think is going to be really difficult, because those 2 days were chock full of a lot of usable ideas and information. I think it's going to be hard for you to distill that down into a little bit, but out of this will come a recommendation or two or three for your consideration. So be aware, Chuck, that there will be recommendations for actions that we want you to endorse. Jessica, Mike, thank you.
Thank you so much. So I wanted to start out, well, first acknowledging that we did 8 versions of this PowerPoint presentation. So it is, in fact, hard to condense what really was a week's worth of activities into less than 15 slides. But really the goal of this presentation is to give a quick overview of what happened at the workshop and some of the key recommendations that well, first off, lessons learned that we heard from the workshop, feedback that we've been getting since the workshop, and then really a set of recommendations for us to discuss. I'd like to acknowledge also all the folks in this room who participated in the workshop in some way. And hang on. Does it work? Anyways, we'll get to it. We had, so Mike and I sort of helped spearhead the planning of it, but we had an excellent planning committee. They're listed up here: Dr. Cliff Dahm, Jay Lund, Tracy Collier, Reiner Hoenecke, Kate Anderson, Amanda Bull, Neer Oxenberg, Aaron Forsman, Ted Summer, Peter Goodwin, and Jeff Lux was really the core group that helped plan this. And there were a tremendous amount of people who attended the workshop that are also here today. So just quick show of hands, who attended or participated in the workshop in some way? Okay, excellent. All right, so let's get into a brief overview of the workshop. So it happened a little over a week ago, 5 working days to be exact, November 1st and 2nd at UC Davis. And Mike, let's start out by just talking a little bit about science enterprise and how we defined it for the workshop and what we're talking about.
So I hope this doesn't create feedback.
I think
no. So we used the term science enterprise to describe this workshop, and it's kind of a central concept. We're using the term to mean all of the science activities that people who are living in, managing, working with these regional systems employ in order to support the policy and management decisions they need to make. So we're not specifically talking about government science programs. We're not specifically talking about privately funded research programs. We're really talking about all of those things jointly. And this concept is important because despite the names of all of the 6 systems that we invited to participate in this workshop, these are not really just about the ecosystems. These science enterprises in these regions also support the social and economic activities that are associated with the people who live in these ecosystems, and also the areas that are economically dependent on those regions. So although these are all marquee systems from an ecological point of view, they're also very important systems from a social and economic point of view. At a first approximation, the 6 systems we looked at account for about just under a third of the U.S. population and hundreds of billions of dollars of gross domestic products. So these are really big. These are really big systems. They're important for reasons that go well beyond ecological interests. So given the complexity and the number of issues that need to be addressed in management in these systems, we felt it was important to really look at science overall and not just at ecosystem science. So we're looking at these more holistically. And our just moving on to the next slide. Our basic program was a 2-day one. We had our 6 systems present on the first day. We invited lead scientists or other people who were in a position of expertise and responsibility in each of those systems to come and talk about what was happening in their systems in terms of the basics, the basic descriptors of how science enterprises operate. The historical factors, the resource management issues that are being addressed, social issues, the relative roles of state, federal, local governments, and private interests in conducting science and management, and so forth. And we spent the second day of the event doing topical panels, and we chose 4 topics for these panels. They were, and I think we're on the next slide at this point, science strategies in large programs. What we really mean is science strategies for programs that are meant to cover the full range of issues that we've been talking about. Governance and adaptive management. Governance is important not just for management, it's also important for science because it helps determine the content of a science program. Funding and resource allocation, where does the money come from, how is it allocated? And fourth, and the fact that this is fourth is not an indication of its importance. I think some of us felt this was the most important topic. Legitimacy, co-production, and communication. We felt this was very important because, again, in considering a science enterprise where multiple issues, multiple management issues, not just ecosystem issues are being addressed, it's important that science be viewed as legitimate, that is, that it be viewed as being credible and relevant, and also that it be real, that people trust that science is being done as a way to reveal the truth rather than to push an agenda. This is an important factor here as it is in a lot of other places. And what we saw in the course of the event was that this topic has salience in all 6 systems that we looked at, and all 6 systems have, to one way or another, addressed the issue either by adopting co-production approaches or other means of ensuring that stakeholders and managers are engaged in the production of science. And a number of the results that you're going to hear about here and later pertain to the lessons we think we learned from what we heard from the other systems in that regard.
So the workshop was attended by about 185 participants overall. We had what amounted to about 4 days of activities. We started out actually taking a lot of the experts that were traveling from outside of California. We took them out on a boat in the Delta and helped them get oriented to what's going on out here. The workshop itself was November 1st and 2nd, as Mike just described. And then we actually had a working session, too, on Thursday, the day after, to help prepare for this presentation and to really get some heads in the room to think about what this might mean for the Delta. So all the recommendations that we're about to talk about are both sort of synthesized at the workshop, during the working session, and then I'll talk about this a little bit more, but we did a survey after the workshop. If you haven't filled out the survey already, please go ahead and fill it out. But we're getting some feedback, too, from the community at large about what some important recommendations are overall. And then we'll talk about this a little bit more too, but we plan on doing a report from the workshop. In your packets, you have a copy of the advanced briefing paper, which was produced prior to the workshop. It's about 20 pages, and it has an overall sort of view of what's going on in each of these systems. We plan on creating a part 2 to this report, which will talk about lessons learned and outcomes overall. So here's our list of sort of overall what we heard. And Mike's going to talk about these in a little bit more detail, but overall, key components of effective science enterprises: integrated modeling and forecasting, peer review or over-the-shoulder, communication on importance of scientific findings, integration of social sciences, willingness to do adaptive management, competitive science funding to attract the best and brightest, and clear leadership and decision-making structure with responsibility at the highest level. So we'll get into that a little bit more.
Yes, and the first thing I'd like to do is remind everyone that this event happened less than 2 weeks ago. And we heard a lot. We had a number of very interesting speakers on both the first day and very interesting panelists on the second day, and it's going to take us a while to fully sort out what we heard. So what I'm about to describe is some first organized thoughts that we had with the organizing committee regarding the messages that we should draw from this event.
So, Mike, is it fair to say that by the time we meet again in April, you will have been able to thoroughly comb through the information and come back with some additional recommendations? But today you've got at least one significant recommendation you're hoping to have endorsed?
Yes.
Good.
Yes, and our intent has been to produce a report within a few months of the event, so I think we're still on track to do that. As Jessica said, we produced the advanced briefing as the first installment of that report, so we already have a portion of what the final report will be, so we should be able to accomplish what you just described. And what I'd like to do is just say a few words about some of the topics that are on the slide right now. These are things that came up repeatedly in discussions from some of these other systems. And again, I would just remind everyone that the 5 other regional systems that we heard from all have major management issues that they're trying to address. So I think the reappearance of some of these themes over and over again in different systems reflects the fact that some of the same issues are bubbling up elsewhere. So it was doubly interesting to us not only to hear some confirmation that the issues that we have here are not unique, but also that some of these other systems have done some fairly creative thinking in some cases about how to address them. So in short, and there won't be a quiz on this afterwards, what we heard, 1, use integrated modeling and forecasting to support decision making. This came up in several other systems. Essentially, the concept is that transparent, credible models that link physical and biological dynamics are important to assuring that decision making is informed. And this is an issue that arises everywhere. These models have been produced in most of these systems. They're fairly well developed in at least 3 of them. A couple of them deal with essentially existential issues. For example, the one in Louisiana deals with the question of not only what's going to happen to local ecosystems, but also what's going to happen to the land over time. Others are more explicitly oriented toward biological issues, for example, in the Everglades. This theme came up repeatedly. It's something that we're going to be developing in much more detail in the report. Denise Reed, who was our guest, who's the director of the Water Institute of the Gulf in Louisiana, actually gave us a diagrammatic figure of how integrated environmental modeling fits in with other types of modeling and other components of the science program down there that we'll probably make use of because it's fairly intuitive in terms of how it describes the role of that kind of modeling. Number 2, independent review processes help to make research more credible, relevant, legitimate, and efficient. And by review processes, we mean to include peer review, independent review, like those from the National Academies and the National Research Council, reviews by bodies like the Independent Science Board, which has an analog in most of the other systems, and also other more creative types of review, for example, over-the-shoulder review, which, again, was described by Denise Reed for the Louisiana system as essentially a more in-depth version of peer review where the review supervision actually occurs during the whole life of the development of the science. There were multiple examples of how these sorts of reviews are conducted that we'll be looking at, and this is an important concept that we think is important to include good development of in the report. The concept in connection with this concept of independent review, the idea of audits also came up, and essentially what's meant here is a very rigorous review of existing programs, particularly monitoring programs, to make sure that the questions they're addressing are still the most important questions that need to be addressed, and that the methods are as efficient as they can be. We heard some examples where these sorts of reviews resulted in pretty significant changes to programs, particularly because long-term monitoring tends to develop a life of its own over time, and it's important to go in with some regularity and make sure that money is actually being spent efficiently. Number 3, clear communication on science findings. This was universal. Everyone felt that clear communication was something that was struggled for in these systems, but it was essential to accomplish it in order to assure public engagement and understanding. And Cliff Dahm gave examples from Queensland, Australia, for the Healthy Waterways Initiative that described what we might view as a model for how to do this in a way that actually engages the public so they understand what you're doing and why you're doing it.
And Mike probably won't say this, but one of the examples from Queensland, Australia is that they had a mascot, a turtle, that they would take to work with the elementary students. And one of the suggestions arose that we actually need a mascot here in the Delta, and maybe a mermaid would work.
Yeah. You're right, I wasn't going to mention that. But there's another aspect to this communication issue, and that is that communication it's essential that communication be two-way between stakeholders and managers and the people conducting the science, as it's an essential mechanism to ensure that science is usable as opposed to just being useful. This is another nugget of a concept that came up repeatedly. And I don't think we need to dwell on it because I'm sure you've all heard this before, but essentially it's the distinction between things that are useful, something that you might want to have on the shelf for reference later, versus something that's usable, meaning that it actually has been done in a way that makes it very relevant to the decisions that you need to make, so that it's something that can be applied directly rather than just as background for some further investigation. It's a very important concept that, again, gets at the efficiency with which science supports management. Number 4, integrate social science with natural science and engineering to understand the full scope of management issues. This was something that came up repeatedly. As I mentioned, it's important to view these regional systems as being more than just about ecology. They're also about the social and economic interests of the people who live in those areas. And one thing that's been developed more in some systems than in others is the use of social science and the integration of social science thinking into the management of science programs, because there was quite a bit of agreement across the board that having social science perspectives was helpful to formulating and refining science programs to make them really useful to people. Be willing to do adaptive management. This isn't strictly a science topic, but it did come up in this workshop more than once. In essence, adaptive management is hard to do, and we heard a number of stories from different systems where people have attempted adaptive management. It's used almost universally now, but there were many fewer examples of its success than what there were examples of its application. We heard a couple of perspectives on what's required for adaptive management to succeed, and we'll be developing those in the report. In short, leadership and an entrepreneurial spirit on the part of the people running the adaptive management program are essential to its success. Adaptive management, in the view of some of the people who spoke, is not going to work if it's done bureaucratically. It really needs a champion in order to succeed. It's also essential that people understand that adaptive management is not experimentation in these systems where there are really crucial management issues. No one who's in a position of having to manage or set policy wants to do experiments. So adaptive management really has to be framed as a mechanism for providing progressively better information to inform decisions over time. It was also commented that it's essential for people who are conducting science to understand the varying levels of tolerance for uncertainty that managers and policymakers have. Frequently, there's a mismatch between the views of scientists on what the concept of uncertainty means versus what managers think uncertainty is. And it's essential to bridge that gap in order for science programs, science leaders to make science as useful as it can be to management. Number 6, use competitive funding mechanisms to attract the best and the brightest. I think the comment was that we're capturing here was a little bit more general than just using competitive funding. It was really that it's important in managing a science enterprise to understand that some of the more difficult problems are only going to be accessible to the best and the brightest, and it's important to find ways to get them working on them. It isn't enough just to put people on a problem. You have to find the right people to put on them. And one way to do that is by competitive funding mechanisms that make funding available to people who are not just agency scientists, but also to academics, to people who are consultants, people who work for NGOs, people in other countries who might have the relevant expertise that you really need to bring at the table. So it's important for people who are engaged in running a science enterprise to understand that and figure out ways to achieve it. And number 7, our last item, it's important to have clear leadership and decision-making structures that have responsibility clearly identified and have links to the highest level of leadership. And the arguments for this, there were multiple arguments made for this from some of the larger systems. Some of the bigger programs, for example, the Great Lakes and Chesapeake and Everglades, have clear links that are established by the organizing documents that go right to the department level in the federal government and to state leadership on the state sides. This was viewed as being essential for a number of reasons, including making sure that programs are actually responsive to the leadership that's ultimately on the hook for programs being executed, but also that leadership is essential to avoid bureaucratic inertia or programs being bogged down and just being about process and not about outcomes, and having those clear leadership links made it easier for programs to have champions that had the support of higher management that were able to go in and really get things done. So we heard different versions of that story, but it was one that kept coming up. So that is an initial digest of what we heard, and I'll turn it over to Jessica to talk about what we think we should do going forward.
So, Mike, great job in distilling a lot of information down to 7 key points. Jessica, for the benefit of those around the table, we know that there is a lot that needs to be worked on that you'll be bringing back to us in April. Help us focus on what it is that you would like this group to endorse,
Sure.
That these agencies can collectively begin working on right away.
Okay, sounds good. So quickly, we sent out a workshop survey, and some early results have come back. We have about a 33% response rate. And you'll see that there are categories listed for key components of effective science enterprise and then lessons learned for the California Bay Delta. The difference between the two tables is the one on the right for the California Bay Delta also includes some lessons on focusing more on climate change impacts in the Delta, and then having more integration between the Bay and the Delta and really the entire watershed. So I would also like to note that on a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 is very important and 4 is important, all of these things ranked as being either important or very important. So we're taking our cues from that. So quickly for next steps and recommendations, I sort of mentioned briefly that there's been a lot of feedback since the workshop, not just the workshop survey, but we've been getting phone calls and hearing from people, and people have been stopping by and dropping in. And I think that it's going to be really important to continue the momentum coming out of this workshop. And there are 3 things that we identified as having a lot of momentum that we think we can take some really sort of early action on. So these 3 key early initiatives are 1, to develop a proposal for improved integrated modeling to focus on forecasting and management decisions on climate change, sea level rise, ecohydrology, or other topics. The second is to develop a joint funding strategy. This is an action that was originally identified in the Delta Science Plan to include new competitive research grants program to attract the best and the brightest and to better integrate social science with natural sciences and engineering. And 3, to develop near-term actions to improve science management and communication between the Bay and the Delta. Let me keep going with the next set, which is to complete the Science Enterprise Workshop Outcomes Report. We've talked about that a little bit, to further define a suite of recommended actions and best practices for improvement to Delta science management, funding, and communication, including, but not limited to, and that's important, a communication and public education plan for the California Bay Delta science community to identify champions that can help support these initiatives. A formal review of science governance and management structure to recommend improvements to better identify leadership, formalize organizational structure, improve decision-making, and in some way through a third party or an audit, and using that as a method. And then additional proposals for how to better integrate social sciences with natural sciences and engineering, and additional tools needed to understand and communicate risks from climate change and sea level rise. So I want to acknowledge that for all of these recommendations, there's work that's been done on these already. These aren't, for us, these aren't brand new ideas. Most of them have had proposals. But there's a lot of momentum. There's a lot of support that we receive from the workshop, both from within the science community and our outside experts who have been checking in with us since then, saying, hey, we're happy to help in some way. So let me keep going, and then we can come back and talk about these recommendations. I think that the third thing is that we'd like to continue to use the DPIIC work groups like the Delta Agency Science Work Group to track progress on current initiatives. So this is sort of a short list of current initiatives. There are more that are going on, but the 2017 Science Action Agenda, the Adaptive Management Framework for Water Operations and Ecosystem Restoration, the Delta ISB Independent Science Board is doing a review of the monitoring enterprise, and then AB 1755, the data management legislation that was just passed is being implemented by many of your agencies. So we think that we can use DPIIC work groups to continue to track progress on a lot of these while still working on proposals for some of the other key initiatives. And then I think our biggest next step and recommendation is to continue to use DPIIC to have as a forum to discuss science and science policy in the Delta. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Randy and the committee to discuss.
Well, I think it would be useful, I'm sure there's a lot of thoughts and comments around the table. Can you help us focus on one particular recommendation that you see could be activated right away?
Sure. I think let's go back to that set of early initiatives here. So these three: develop a proposal for improved integrated modeling, developing a joint funding strategy, and developing some near-term actions to improve science management and communication between the Bay and the Delta. I think that's probably a good start. starting point for our discussion.
Okay. It was my sense from the discussions that occurred on the third day by about 50, 60 people in the room that integrated the need for better integrating models for forecasting seemed to rise to the highest level of interest. And it seemed to me that that would be something that could be done in a work group setting if those agencies around the table that have interests in modeling could designate someone to come and discuss. It seemed like that might present the greatest opportunity for immediate action as more of the recommendations coming out of the Science Enterprise Workshop are being formulated. So with that, that's one idea, but you've certainly heard a lot of ideas that came out of this Science Enterprise Workshop. Thoughts, reactions, suggestions, hope? Yes, Mark.
If I had been there, I would know the answer to this question. So apologies up front and thank you for this work. But I wonder if we could get just a little more information on just what we mean by integrating models. How does that relate to models that are in existing use? What kind of time frames are we talking about to actually get something that's functional? And why shouldn't I be skeptical that this will just be more vaporware?
Yeah, Mark, I'll hazard an initial response, but I think other people would need to weigh in on this. We're talking about models that specifically relate both the physical and biological parts of the environment. There aren't very many of those in our system right now. There are a lot of physical models and there are a lot of biological models, but ones that actually integrate both of those, particularly ones that also incorporate hydrology and changes in atmospheric dynamics over time are thin on the ground. The question you're raising about what would be the initial objective and what would be the timeline, those are important questions. And I think the dialogue we've had about this, what we've talked about doing is having a Chair Fiorini, I hope I'm not stepping on the comment you made earlier. We were talking about the desirability of having a small committee get together in order to frame how this would be done, preferably within existing resources, and on a specifically chosen problem that everyone agrees would be useful to address and could be addressed in a reasonable amount of time. But that's an absolutely great question because this is clearly an area where if it isn't done carefully, it could overlap with existing efforts, or it could result in an effort that took a long time to resolve.
I think it would probably be helpful to hear from Dr. Cliff Daum to cite some successes that have come out of the integrated modeling approach. That was from a couple of the areas that we heard from 2 weeks ago.
So modeling is a tool that I use in my research, but it's not something that I do as a part of my daily science life. But Peter Goodwin, who was here before me, was very much an excellent modeler. And the idea, I think, of this of integrated modeling, I'm going to approach it from someone who uses models rather than someone who develops models. We heard 3 nice examples, I thought, at the workshop that I hope will give you an idea of what we mean by this idea of integrated modeling. In Louisiana, the focus of this massive effort that they have there is to basically protect their coastline. They're trying to stop the rapid loss of land that is occurring along the coast. And to do that, they really have to consider options that have to do with the way they route fresh water and the way they route sediment in that fresh water into the coastal Louisiana area. To do that, they needed something that was spatially explicit that dealt with all of the coastline of Louisiana, and that required getting the engineering models, the sediment transport models, the hydrodynamic models, and the coastal ocean models all working together. And so they went to the governor's office and they basically said,
We've got to do this. This is something that we really now need to move quickly on. We have some resources from the BP settlement to be able to do this. The governor's office provided the resources, and they brought modelers, about 50 or 60 of them, from throughout the state of Louisiana. They came from the private sector, they came from their universities, they came from many of the agencies, both state and federal. They came together, and in 18 months they developed this linked integrated model to basically provide them with ideas as to what different kinds of scenarios might mean to protecting different parts of their coastline. And so that was an example of where they mobilized the expertise, they mobilized the capacity to do this, they brought together the best of the best, and in an 18-month period came up with something that now has become the focus of their planning effort, and then they're starting to implement this to try to protect that loss of coastal land. So that was an example of pulling together modeling capacity, much like we have here in the Delta and the Bay. We have modeling capacity in many of the agencies. We have modeling capacity in many of our academic institutions. We have modeling capacity that's in many of the private companies that are around. What the idea here is to get these people actually on a regular basis interacting with each other, communicating with each other, maybe even having a physical structure, a place where they can go and work together, where they have the computational resources they need, and where they can take one model and link it to another model and make sure that they're basically driving a set of scenarios that allow some of these complex problems to be addressed. Two other examples that I could point out was in Everglades. So in Everglades, the two big issues there are water quality and invasive species. And so they really needed to have a better sense of how water quality is affecting the changing condition of the Everglades, mainly by facilitating a lot of these invasive species problems that they have. This required then the coupling of really accurate hydrodynamic models with models that could model the biogeochemical processes that would be going on so that they could then actually design structurally locations within the Everglades where they could deal with this excess nutrient loading that's coming in from agricultural areas to the north. And so this was an example where they also invested a huge amount of effort in getting different types of modelers working together to address questions that were of concern to the Everglades. The third example, I think, is the Chesapeake Bay. Chesapeake Bay, again, it's a water quality focused issue. In this case, turbidity causing optical deterioration of the bay, and then also water quality problems that are producing low oxygen and hypoxia problems within there. So again, it's this getting a good representation of the hydrodynamics of the Chesapeake Bay and then linking it to all of these disparate sources of sediment and disparate sources of nutrients coming in from 7 states and the DC area, getting those models linked, working together, getting people from the 7 different states involved, so it was a multi-state and multi-agency effort. So these are the kind of things that we're thinking about trying to facilitate here in the Delta. Many of your agencies have outstanding modeling programs, but we really would like to facilitate getting these interactions and these discussions and these dialogues going, and also getting progress on where models that might do the same thing but don't always give you the same answer. Run them on the same data sets. See exactly where they're coalescing. See where there is divergence. And use that as a learning exercise. So this is, I think, the basic concept that we heard from the workshop. Hopefully that gives you some examples of how it's been used effectively in some of the other systems we heard about.
Paul? Thank you for your work. I heard great things about the event. Regarding the recommendation for modeling, I have a love-hate relationship with modeling. I think at its best it can be extraordinarily helpful, and at its worst it can become a rabbit hole. So I always think it's good for people to get together and brainstorm to determine what kind of integrated modeling might help us. So I would support that, but I do think before any decisions would be made that would require a lot of a deep dive into it, that we want to be sure this group, the leadership of the organizations, is engaged so that we're making sure our limited capacity is spent on the most important activities.
Yes, Michelle?
So I maybe this sort of tears off of what Paul sort of said, but in my own way. So I agree. I think this is good work. I think the integration of models is a great idea. I think it's great concept, it almost seems like this is more of a two-part process. It almost seems like, first of all, we need to sort of figure out what the shared objectives are for integration of those models, actually making that call, which may or may not actually be a technical discussion. And then it seems like pulling the technical folks together to kind of hash out how we integrate those models to achieve those objectives. So I just don't want to put the cart before the horse, getting technical folks in a room to discuss integration when I think we need to have the discussion about what we're integrating to achieve.
I think along those lines, the intent would be for presumably the fish and the water agencies around the table to identify someone in their organization that could meet collectively to have that conversation, and by April of next year, bring back any recommendations for consideration. That would be our intent. So a select group of people discussing the possibilities and potentially bringing back some recommended actions to be considered here. Mary?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to add sort of another complexity that all the agencies are very aware of. We have a significant long-term project like California Water Fix, formerly BDCP, how you adaptively manage the scientific review when it's a long-term project over multiple years and the science is ever-changing. I think our Delta environment is one of the most widely studied environments probably in the nation, if not even competitive on a worldwide basis. But how do we adaptively manage new science as it comes in while we're reviewing current projects, tools, data, modeling? And I'd like to see information come forward of how we can move with a project, move with the new science as we're looking at impacts on the environment and on the Delta. And I don't know if that was discussed at the forum or not. I also wanted to compliment Jessica and Mike on the great effort. It was a heroic lift, and certainly you've moved a mountain with that. And lastly, Mr. Chairman, on the slide before us, I don't have a page number, but it does indicate sort of the Bay Delta with a dividing line between it. And I would just like to emphasize that those of us in the Delta see it as one environment, not separated. And I'd like to see that incorporated also into the review and the effort that comes back, that we're looking at as one environment, not two, not a separate and distinct boundary. Thank you.
So Jessica and Mike, we have a Delta Agency Science Work Group in place today, and I presume that you view that as the likely recipient of all of these recommendations that have come out of the Science Enterprise Workshop. And then I'm envisioning, if there is an appetite around the table to consider advancing integrated modeling, that would be handled by a separate group with a discrete assignment. Do I have that about right?
Mm-hmm. So the Delta Agency Science Work Group was really helpful in identifying the high-impact science actions, and we plan on continuing to use them on development of the science action agenda. I think for this, for sort of the initial proposal for the integrated modeling piece, it might be good to open up the discussion with sort of a larger audience. So more than agency staff. We talked a little bit about academics and the role of academics at the workshop and how important that is, and there's significant resources at universities around here. But I think maybe in terms of next step, there's been some discussion of sort of key folks that might be able to help guide us both at the technical level and sort of figuring out how to define the objectives of a proposal like this. So I think we might start with that group, put together a proposal, and use the Delta Agency Science Work Group as sort of a subset of the DPIIC committee to test those ideas, to review that proposal, and then when we come back in April at the next meeting to have a really good proposal that we can move from.
What's the committee think of that approach? I see nodding of heads in the affirmative. Maria?
Yeah, I just want to speak up and support some work on this. I mean, there are existing modeling forms, but I think taking a fresh look as a result of this conference, and especially the focus on forecasting and the focus on linking hydrodynamic models or physical models with biological models, I think is really helpful to get that focus. I also wrote down, Mike, what you said about usable science as opposed to useful science. So maybe giving that team a little bit of guidance to make sure whatever they're thinking about is usable, because I think we all have seen a lot of models generated with very good intentions, but they don't really hit the mark when you try to push them across to the management side of the house. So.
Right. And I think one of the things that we heard also is that integrated modeling is very useful when it comes to forecasting. And this is outside of my area of expertise, but one of the analogies that was used at the workshop was it's nice to have a weather forecast that told you that it rained yesterday at 3 o'clock. It's even more important to know what the weather is going to be like in 10 days, and even more important to understand what climate conditions are going to be in the long term. So I think the integrated modeling proposal, I think its usefulness is really strong in the forecasting side and helping us. And, from certainly the Delta Stewardship Council's perspective, we have a long-term management goal for the Delta. We're looking out at 2100 in our plan, and I think this is something that can be really supportive of that overall. So I think that's sort of an initial set of objectives for it.
Mark?
Yeah, I just want to say I'm encouraged by a lot of the comments I'm hearing, because to me, a key to a good integrated modeling isn't just modeling that combines the physical and the biological. It's integrated across agencies, and it's integrated, as you were saying, Maria, between the science and the resource communities. So I really encourage you, as you work with the science group to figure out how to move this forward, take those into account too. I think that's got to be part of the ultimate end game that we're going for.
The last thing I would say is if you have resources within your agencies, staff who understand modeling, who are working on any sort of projects that are in this realm, who you think would be really important to have involved, please let me know and Mike know. We're definitely looking for a good team.
Okay, so we've separated out one segment of the recommendations that came out of the Science Enterprise Workshop. We've focused very narrowly on the potential for integrated modeling. That's one issue. The other issue is the greater set of lessons learned to be considered and potentially employed in the work that we do in the Delta. So I want to bifurcate those for a moment and see, number one, as it relates to deploying someone from your agencies to work together on considering how modeling some recommendations for integrated modeling might be brought back to us. Is there a willingness to commit human resources to that project over the next 6 months? Yes, Felicia.
Within reason. I mean, no, it's getting back to Paul's point. I think exploring it and seeing if there's a cost benefit, there's value there in a relatively short term with a limited amount of time is something I think we could. But if it's somebody full-time to work on a work group, we have like way too many other things that we have to do. And so there's always the cost benefit of it would be nice to, but I've been sitting here going back and forth on all these things to say, how do you prioritize amongst them? And we're not made of scientists. None of us are.
So we have one maybe.
I'm a firm maybe as well.
Okay, we have
but
two maybes.
Let me caveat my firm maybe. No, I agree with the general comments made and concern about the adventures through the rabbit holes. I do think in the spirit of a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step, that this is a solid recommendation. I would propose, maybe it's too early for this, but as we get the next report, I think it's important not only to consider bringing technical modeling experts from our agencies together, but someone from our agencies that also deals with policy, decision-making, usefulness of models, because frankly, even the best integrated modeling system we might develop is useless unless there is buy-in from all of our agencies and a commitment to adopt and use such a framework. And speaking very bluntly, I think we all have our own protocols, our own ways of doing business, and some of that will have to be overcome if we're to adopt a new approach.
Yeah, I hear you. Okay, so 2 maybes with 1 caveat. We need at least 3 or 4. 1, 2. Okay. Okay, Chuck.
How about y'all come back with a specific proposal instead of an open-ended one that might facilitate, moving the maybes to yes. So you have a sense of the boundaries and the possible workload. I think it's the right place to start when you say integrate models, but there's a whole heck of a lot more that you need to understand to make an informed opinion on how to allocate some of the resources.
Okay. How would you like to receive that recommendation?
Well, I would imagine Jessica already knows what she'd do if she was going to write a 2-page memo that puts some specifics on it. But I think that kind of granularity might be informative for us to take a look at as a group. Okay. One of the challenges you have is we meet only periodically. So I don't think it's an item you want to completely wait on until the next time we reconvene.
No, we don't. All right. Well, what I'm gathering from this is there's an appetite to consider this, but it needs to be well defined. So, Chuck, I'm going to take your comments as a maybe, subject to a tighter definition of what would be expected and what the deliverables would be from this group that would be reporting back in April. So I think we'll proceed on that basis and provide you all, agencies who have expressed an interest in this, greater detail. So with the understanding that you can opt out if you don't like the details, or you can workshop those details to make it something that is useful and usable. Okay? So now the greater good of the Science Enterprise Workshop was many lessons learned, many recommendations that came out of that. How do you want this group to react to those?
First off, I'm happy to write a memo. And I think the deadline that we've set for ourselves for the workshop report, we've said in the next few months. I think we can start to have some pretty early drafts by the end of this year, maybe January, and we'd like to circulate those. There are some big ideas in here. When you talk about creating a joint funding strategy, there's always a lot of concerns that come up about agency funds. Does that mean that you want me to take some of my agency funds and put them in a common pool? Well, I think there's a lot of options for how we do any of these things, and we have really good models from these other systems. So I think the biggest next step is to really create this workshop outcomes report, to ask some of your staff to review it, those who have been involved in the workshop, both the planning and participation. And then let's go with next steps that are coming out of the report. Which recommendations can we take on after the integrated modeling piece? I think priorities are often best in either 1 or 4. So I don't think we should try and tackle too many of these at any one time, but there are some important things that are coming out of the workshop that would be good to get started on. So.
Well, to assist in that effort, is there anything that you all noted in the recommendations coming out of the Science Enterprise Workshop that rose to a high level of interest for you? Anything of the 7 recommendations that Mike walked through? Michelle?
I think from our end, mainly because the Bureau of Reclamation, we do fund a substantial amount of science. I really like the competitive process idea. I think, we need to think about that a little bit in the context of what we already fund, and also how I think that competitive process probably overlaps and or integrates with existing processes like CSAMP, IEP, and even our own existing reasonable and prudent alternative implementation. So we probably want to have that discussion, quite frankly. But I think for our end of things, we probably want to look at competitive science as a real viable option in the future, and looking at future adaptive management processes, science modeling, things of that nature.
Great, that's helpful. Mark?
Yeah, and this may sound strange coming from me as part of what you might think of as a hard science agency, but I was really struck by the issue of more social sciences, how to integrate that in our work here. And I will just make the general comment that almost every forum where I'm dealing with interagency science needs and things that they'd like to do, whether it be climate change or drought, that keeps coming up, that we need more social science integration. So it's interesting to see it come up again.
Yeah, it certainly stimulated a lot of interesting conversation at the workshop. A lot to learn about social science. Anything else that struck you as being, Felicia, as very important?
Well, I'm sort of a broken record on this one. I think anything on figuring out how to help us all communicate better, to translate and bridge between science and policy. Some people are just naturals and good at it. Others are incredibly good at what they do but need some help translating it so the others of us can understand it, and vice versa, as a two-way street. And I think you've made some really great strides in that over the course of years. One of the signal accomplishments, but we still all have a long way to go, so I wouldn't want to put that by the wayside. That always stays at the top of my list, just so as not to be the tree falling in the forest. You could always have Cliff explain everything, and then at least I'll understand it. But working, I think, collectively on how to make it, I liked usable and not just useful. That was really good. I just think that has to be a constant, that posted on the bathroom mirror, that we have to think about all the time, because we're pulled together precisely to try and figure out how to make that kind of thing work.
And I was particularly impressed with what we heard from the Chesapeake Bay and the Florida Everglades in terms of communication. That there's some really good guidelines or examples to draw from there. Tomas?
Yeah, I just wanted to second what Felicia said about the communication aspect. We do a lot of great work, and we are just as guilty of not being able to communicate as effectively on the science. One of the things that struck me that Mary mentioned is, looking at the entire watershed from the Bay all the way to San Francisco. And one of the things that I was going to mention, and you probably already know this, is the 2016 San Francisco blueprint is out, and it includes not just San Francisco, but it also includes the Delta. And as we think about resources and funding, it'd be good to also leverage those existing efforts that are underway to make sure that we are taking advantage of other resources and capacity that's out there. And yeah, so I just wanted to make sure that we are doing that, not just with the modeling, but with things in general.
Paul?
This is probably more of a question than a recommendation, so I'm sorry if I'm complicating your request. But one of the things that I've found in my career is oftentimes it's really important to revisit the decisions that have been made in science investment in the past and ask, are these really the most important questions? I've always found that the real magic occurs when you have policymakers and scientists working together and identifying the important investments that are going to allow us to have information in real time to make the best choices. And I found in my time in the Everglades, we had to have a really purposeful effort to bring that conversation together. And sometimes it was a challenge because we all have passion and there are legacy investments that can occur and people don't want to let go of issues. But the reality is our budgets are such that we're not looking at increases these days. When you see investments, you're talking about taking that money from somewhere else. So I guess my question would be, in this workshop, did this conversation come up? And do we feel like in the Delta that we have the apparatus in place that allows us to have those regular check-ins, vertical integration, scientists and policymakers looking at what we're investing in and making sure we're investing in the right things?
Good questions. For anybody that attended, would you like to take a stab at it?
I'll bite a little bit, Randy,
Okay.
on that.
Thanks,
Just
Randy.
in that one thing I noted in attending the workshop, and this isn't a direct answer to your question, Paul, but I noticed that the workshop really wasn't structured to evaluate and what we were doing or to bring forward sort of the successes of what we were doing in order to effectively build on what we're doing. So I don't know what that means, but I'm curious in, the thoughts of the folks who organized the workshop. Maybe there's a way to look at this comparative model with, the other places, but also kind of quickly be able to synthesize how are we measuring up and are there some successes that we're doing that we ought to, all take some credit for and keep advancing. Because when you raise that question, my mind goes to, IEP and various different efforts to, kind of do some resets on IEP. But that, again, that wasn't really part of the conversation in the workshop. Also, there's the CSAMP process, the collaborative science process there. That's kind of a newer approach to invent collaboration around science. And there was a great term for doing that kind of science that Mark Lubell had. It was like post-normal science or something. It was like beyond the bounds of normal science that I thought was really like a great term. But it wasn't specifically kind of brought forward and evaluated. So I don't know if that gives any thoughts for you folks to comment on. But
So what I've heard through this discussion is beyond integrated modeling and sort of a more defined proposal for that a more defined proposal for a competitive process for science, for integration of social science, for communication and picking up on the San Francisco blueprint, the estuary blueprint, integration with what's being done in the Bay, and then decisions on how we're investing in science. So I think we did talk about that at the workshop. We talked about other models for how that's done. There were some examples from coastal Louisiana. There were, I think, a few of the experts that came out that had experienced that directly, whether it was from within their own agency or from a program overall, how you really look at the governance structure and tailor it to be efficient and really build capacity. So those four things, I'd like to propose that maybe we not just do the workshop enterprise or the workshop outcomes report, but that we really put together more detailed proposals for those four things. I think those are really important, and there's a lot of ideas about how to do that and how to do it well. And I think if we have maybe some participation from agency staff and some outside input, both from the experts that came to the workshop and others who are interested, that we can quickly put together some good proposals and bring it back.
Mark, you were going to respond to Paul's question?
No, I was just going to add further confusion, Randy.
Just glad we're not a
I think I was thinking along the same lines as Maria, and I don't mean to complicate things too much, but aside from recommendation 1 here, the 2 through 7 seems largely like common sense sort of ideas that have been contemplated before to me. And of course, it makes me wonder why we haven't been successful in adopting these approaches in the past. And, if you ask me to answer that question, the highest hurdle we have in being more successful in these recommendations is the way that we govern ourselves between our agencies. And that's exactly why we're sitting around this table today, to try to do that better. So I think my recommendation is that, sure, we can continue to look at how we can do some of these specific things better, but I think we ought to adopt these components, if you will, as the guiding principles for how we work around this table.
I like that. I like that. Yeah, Mary? You want to second that?
I'll second that. Certainly, I will second that. Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to recognize that the Delta Protection Commission is not highly staffed. We have a robust staff of a handful of folks that work really hard, but I certainly will offer our support for the motion and whatever effort we can put together to support the effort. But I also want to comment on the National Heritage Designation efforts that the Delta Protection Commission has been embarked upon for a number of years now, and how we get the attention and support from the federal government for such a designation to occur, and if we were able to achieve it, what level of an umbrella that might provide to also create more robustness to this effort that we're talking about, how we coordinate, how we collaborate, and how we work better together beyond our silos and roles and responsibilities, but in the best interest for the Delta and California's interests as well. So I don't want to lose sight of the National Heritage Designation effort. It's been recognized at the Chesapeake Bay, Florida Everglades, and other community projects statewide, multiple state benefit, and yet we don't have that designation here for the Delta, and I think it's something that we need to continue to work upon as well.
Okay. Mark, back to your recommendation. Which list are you referring to? I want to make sure we're all...
I'm looking at
okay,
the 1 through 7.
The 7 key components.
Right, right. And as I attempted to say, I think 1 is a fairly, well, I haven't heard this one in a while, let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. But 2 through 7, at least, I think, are more ways of conducting business as opposed to specific initiatives.
Okay. All right. Hope nobody got hurt. So we are a consensus group. Is there a consensus that we should adopt these 7 key components as our aspirational goals in the way we conduct business in the Delta? Or the Bay Delta, I guess it was one of the recommendations. All right, I think, yeah.
But that would include, in addition to the recommendation that Jessica developed about further developing some of these into actual work items to be brought back as well.
Yeah, I think those will...
Didn't want to lose that part.
This is the umbrella under which activities will now occur along the lines of the recommendations that you've outlined. Yes, Mark.
So I have no objections to any of these. My question is more just not quite sure. What would it mean if these become our aspirational goals, or if we were to adopt these as some sort of guiding principles?
Well, I think what it means is that what I got out of the enterprise workshop that led to these conclusions was that we have the most complex ecosystem of any of the areas that were present by far. And that these are elements that were parts of the success of many of those key areas that are mapped around the room. I think the challenge now is to have someone, and I'm hoping that you will agree to designate someone from each of your agencies to take a look at these key components and determine specific actions that could be implemented to better manage science, to seek better funding, to develop better communication options or mechanisms. So I think out of this will come specifics, and this will help us to focus on the things that have worked well in other areas that we want to figure out ways to do better here. But it's going to require, ultimately it's going to require a work group. It's going to require a group of folks that are given some direction and asked to report back in 6 months to you all about some specific actions that should be incorporated among many agencies.
And Randy, just quickly, so in terms of guiding principles and what it would mean for us here on the ground, there was sort of that short list of ongoing efforts that really are in line with some of the best practices that we heard coming out of these different systems. So developing a science action agenda, we've already started on that. That's really already a collaborative effort. And through that process, they're starting to understand that we do need to integrate social science and a social science research into what we do in the Delta. So I think these guiding principles can be applied to the ongoing efforts. You know, I talked a little bit about the Delta ISB and their review of the monitoring enterprise. They do a lot of reviews. Delta Science Program does a lot of peer reviews, and there's a lot of other agencies that are also building that capacity to do peer review and independent review. So I think the guiding principles can sort of help enhance efforts that are ongoing and are really a good reminder for all of us as we move through the planning process on some of these other things.
So, Mark?
So not to belabor the point, I know we have other things on the agenda, but I perhaps misinterpreted. I was thinking that Mark was suggesting something beyond actions, that these are more maybe the types of principles against we should measure all of our activities as opposed to specific actions. And so that's what I thought I heard.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think it works both ways. There are specific things we can figure out how to do better relative to any one of these discrete actions. But I think this might not be the complete list, but it's a good list. And if we periodically reviewed it to see how we're doing relative to this list and our collective actions in the Bay Delta, I think that would be worthwhile.
All right, that's pretty clear. So I think we have approval to seek out representatives from these agencies to work with to help formalize some, working with these principles to formalize some recommended actions. Okay? Anything else? Cliff?
I just want to add one comment to the discussion here, and that is for progress to be made on many of these items that we've talked about here, including the ones that you've talked about, maybe becoming more specific on the items. They really don't happen unless you have a champion. You really need to have a full-time person who really passionately wants to see it get done. Forming committees isn't a particularly effective way of getting these things implemented. So I would like us to think seriously about getting a champion for a few of these key things that works full-time to make it happen, much like we've had David Okita and Chris Chernell working on Eco-Restore. Some similar kind of commitment of an individual, I think, would make these much more likely to happen. My thoughts.
Good thoughts, and likely that that will hopefully be something we're talking about in April or sooner. Okay, I don't know about you all, but I'm ready for a break. How about if we take a 10-minute break and reconvene at 3:10 and pick it up with agenda item number 3. Thank you. And find a seat.
Perfect.
Holiday-themed coffee cup. While you're returning to your chairs, I want to mention that we have two of my colleagues from the Stewardship Council here. In addition to Supervisor Pifo, we have our Vice Chair Susan Tatayan and Council Member Patrick Johnston, and somewhere out there is our Executive Officer Jessica Pearson. So thanks to my team for attending today. The next item is Agenda Item 3, entitled Linking Best Available Science and Decision Making. We've got two significantly important reports for to be reviewed for you today. I have four panelists that I will be introducing, and then we will begin receiving the reports on those two important documents. The State of the Bay Delta Science 2016 reflects the contributions of 50 authors, guided by an editorial board member including Michael Healy, and I believe Michael Dettinger is also here in the room, or was one of the co-editors, along with Richard Norgard. 15 chapters are being published. Some have been released in the peer-reviewed journal San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science. Our panelists include Darcy Austin, a program manager for the Delta Science Program in the Delta Stewardship Council, and has been the lead in organizing the State of Bay Delta Science 2016 report. Michael Healy is seated next to her, Professor Emeritus at the University of British Columbia, and as mentioned, served on the editorial board for the State of Bay Delta Science 2016. Following the report from Darcy and Michael Healy, Letitia Grenier, who is Resilient Landscapes Program Director for the San Francisco Estuary Institute, will present on a Delta Renewed, a report that SFEI is releasing today during our DPIIC meeting. Each DPIIC committee member will receive a copy of this report, which I believe is right, looks like that. And then finally, Carl Wilcox is policy advisor to the director for the Bay Delta Regional Manager for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Panelists, welcome. Darcy, tell us about the State of Bay Delta Science 2016 report.
Okay, thank you, Randy. So I'm just going to do a bit of an introduction for everybody, and I'm going to point to some comments that I heard this afternoon, not this morning. We heard that people are looking for a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. We heard that people want to hear about the big picture. And we heard a lot about communicating science, and I'm hoping that you will find that the State of Bay Delta Science embodies those and many other things. So the State of Bay Delta Science is a synthesis of the current scientific information of the Bay and Delta, emphasizing progress made on key research questions and remaining knowledge gaps. And it's a key element of the, oops, I'm sorry, I forgot I should be doing the slides. Okay. And it's a key element of the Delta Science strategy. And those elements include the Delta Science Plan, which is a shared vision for Delta Science, and the Science Action Agenda, and that is a compilation of prioritized science actions and a collaborative roadmap for science. And I just wanted to point out that the knowledge gaps identified in State of Bay Delta Science 2016, and if I call it SBDS 2016, then you'll know what it is. So those knowledge gaps will be used to help guide the Science Action Agenda for 2017. And then subsequently, the actions from the Science Action Agenda, that information will be incorporated into the next iteration of the State of Bay Delta Science. Okay, and so this latest edition builds on the first edition, which was published in 2008. And chapter topics include, chapter topics address the most relevant scientific issues in the Delta that were identified by senior scientists and managers. And we really had two audiences. We had chapter topics that covered contaminants and levee stability, Delta food webs, and recent discoveries about salmon. And if you look at the back page of the State of Bay Delta Science Summary for Policymakers, you will see a list of all those chapters. These chapters were published in the online journal, San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Sciences, and there is one more volume that'll be published in December. And then our second sort of tier of people that we were trying to communicate to was policymakers, decision makers, and that's what this really is about, this glossy summary for policymakers. And I just wanted to mention, this is a lot of names. You don't have to read them all, but the chapters represent about 3 years of work. We started thinking about this 3 years ago. We had 3 editorial board members. We had 2 managing editors. I'd like to thank Maggie Chrisman for her efforts on this project. We had a very dedicated team publishing at the online journal and their reviewers as well. We had 2 lead scientists, unless you consider Michael Healy the 3rd lead scientist, but 2 acting lead scientists while we were working on this project. And we had 50 authors, as Randy mentioned. And we also had a technical editor, Ariel Okamoto, help us with this product. And just a number of other folks who supported this effort, including our council communication staff, legislative staff, and Jessica Law helped us with some of the review on this to help us get the message, the tone and the messaging and the language correct for this. So with that longer introduction than I thought, I'm going to introduce Michael Healy, who is one of our chief editors on the editorial board.
Well, thanks, Darcy, and thanks for inviting us to come to your meeting and present this summary. First of all, I want to say that what I'll be talking about today is really drawn from this summary, which is a summary of another document. And the other document is entitled Perspectives on Bay Delta Science and Policy, which was an overview, partially a synthesis, and also a exploration of policy implications from the more technical papers in the State of Bay Delta Science 2016. So most of you are probably familiar with, or at least have seen, the SBDS 2008 version, which we really wrote in a way that we hoped would be readable and useful for decision makers and policymakers and managers. But SBDS 2016, the individual papers were more written for a technical audience. And although we hope that most of you will take a look at them, and some of you may find them interesting, they weren't really directed at policymakers or decision makers. So the editorial board felt that it would be important to have at least one chapter or one paper from this series that was specifically aimed at people like you. And that is this paper titled Summary or Perspectives on Bay Delta Science and Policy that will appear in the December issue of San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Sciences. And this is a summary of that document. The editorial board for SBDS 2016 was the same 3 people as the editorial board for SBDS 2008, so there's a continuity there. We knew what had been done in the past, and we hoped we could bring that forward into the future. No. The longer paper from which this is for which this is a summary is really divided into three main sections. One that looks at new science perspectives, which is titled "What Have We Learned Since 2008?" up here on the slide. The second section of that article talks about scientific tools, new scientific tools that have been particularly important in allowing us to make the advances in science that have occurred over the past 8 years. And then the final section is policy perspectives, which in this presentation we're going to distill down into some forward-looking actions. There is no forward-looking action section in that longer document, but these ideas are extracted from it. Am I pushing the wrong button? Oh, there we go. Okay, so what have we learned since 2008? And these bullet points summarize some of the key scientific points that come out of the papers that are published in San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science. Some of these are reprised from 2008, but have received greater emphasis in the intervening time. Others are newer ideas. First bullet you'll see there is nutrients are important. And what's been happening in the Delta is that turbidity levels are going down. The Delta waters are getting more transparent. And as a result, more light is penetrating, and so plant growth is being stimulated. And although the Delta has always had a pretty high load of nutrients, in the past the impact of those nutrients was masked by the high turbidity loads in the Delta. As turbidity has decreased, then nutrients are becoming more important as a driver of primary production at the bottom of the food web, and also potentially as influencing the growth of invasive species that we are concerned about, things like microcystis and Egeria. And so nutrients are now taking on a stronger role in our consideration and concerns about how the Delta food web operates. The second bullet is one we've been talking about for some time, that the Delta waters contain a complex of cocktail of contaminants coming from agricultural runoff, from urban runoff, and some from industrial activities. The strategic plan for CalFed in 2000 said that this was a problem that had not received enough attention and encouraged us to get on with it. The 2008 SBDS said this is still a problem. We haven't spent enough time on it. Well, we're saying again, this is a problem that we really need to pay more attention to. But fortunately now we have some better tools to help us explore the implications of the contaminant load in the Delta for aquatic species and potentially for human health. Also, the regional monitoring program for the Delta is now going to start gathering regular information on contaminant loading in the Delta, so over time we'll be much better placed to understand this level of concern. The third new science perspective is that aquatic food webs no longer sustain native species. Again, we anticipated this in 2008, but it's over the intervening years become much clearer that the changes in the aquatic food web as a result of species invasions and changing conditions in the Delta mean that native species are not well supported by that food web anymore. And this is certainly a contributor to the imperiled state of many of the native species in the Delta. Only one of several factors that are impacting our native species, but there does appear to have been a regime change in the food web in the Delta. It appears that we cannot reverse this regime change, and so we're going to have to live with the current situation in the Delta, and any attempts to make things better for native species are going to have to take that current situation very much into account. Fourth bullet follows from that one, that species declines are a result of multiple factors in the Delta. When I first came to work down here in the early 2000s, everybody thought it's all about exports. Other things have happened, but exports were the big deal. But with the pelagic organism decline and the analyses associated with that, it became clear that although water exports were a factor, that wasn't the only factor that was affecting the well-being of native species. And it's only become ever more clear over time that species declines are a result of multiple stressors. And it's still not clear whether we can reduce the burden of those stressors enough on native species for them to sustain viable populations in the delta. The fourth bullet here is that future water management will be driven by more extreme events. Climate change is the big background here, but there are other changing factors in the delta that are impacting on water management and also on ecosystem management. And it's becoming more clear that major events are more likely to drive management change than the gradual serial change in things like water temperature or water flow. So we think it's time to begin planning for the way that bigger floods, longer droughts are going to impact the way we manage water, then imagine this is going to be a gradual pattern of change over time. The sixth bullet here, and this is something that Latricia will talk about, is that the success of local restoration is going to be dependent on what happens in adjacent habitats. That is, the delta is a landscape that's a mosaic of interacting ecosystems. And we won't be able to understand the way in which we can achieve the goal of a healthy ecosystem without understanding the interplay among all of those ecosystems. And this brings into play the subject or the field of landscape ecology, which has been widely talked about in the Delta, but so far is not well integrated into the planning and management process of the Delta. And the seventh one is something you all know, that the situation for native species is pretty dire. Several of them are on the brink, particularly Delta smelt. And so we're suggesting that it's time to start thinking about other ways to address the conservation of these species other than conservation in place. And all the effort goes on to habitat restoration in the Delta, trying to make the Delta a suitable home for these species, and that work has to continue, but in anticipation that that may not be sufficient, we think it's time for the science community to begin thinking about alternatives to conservation in place. Things like assisted relocation, cryopreservation, establishing refuge populations. For many of these species, we don't know how to do that, and it would be nice to have some background of scientific understanding in case we have to bring those alternative mechanisms into play. Okay, I mentioned new tools for science, and I just can't emphasize enough how important the development of scientific tools is to our advancing understanding of the science of the Delta. So there's a list of 6 here. We elaborate on these more fully in the longer article that I mentioned to you. I won't say a lot about these, just to remind you that all of these tools, the development of miniaturized tags for fish that have helped us to understand much better where species like salmon move through the Delta and how they're impacted by hydrodynamics, new remote sensors that provide pretty well continuous recording of water quality parameters, advances in 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional hydrodynamic modeling that have allowed us to understand much better the relationship between water flows and fish movements in the Delta, remote sensing tools that can be used to assist us to understand the complex structure of the levees and how vulnerable they may be to things like sea level rise, flood, or earthquake. New tools for downscaling global climate predictions to the local level so we can understand much better what kinds of weather and climate we're going to be looking at in the future, particularly with regard to its impact for water supplies and things like longer-term droughts. And new analytic tools for water quality that provide a much more flexible set of tools for exploring the impact of water quality on aquatic species. These have all given us a much stronger foundation for exploring a number of the issues that are particularly important for management of the delta. And finally, we put forward a number of actions that we hope you will consider in your future planning. And one of the things I was struck by in listening to the Science Enterprises summary was there's a pretty significant overlap between what we came up with, completely independent of that activity, and many of the things that were suggested to you. So it was gratifying to see that we weren't at least talking at cross purposes. But one of the things that we think is important is that there needs to be, from a scientific perspective, and this will feed into the policy process, some longer-term thinking. You know, looking many decades into the future was part of the Delta visioning exercise that went on a few years ago. But it's not clear to us that this kind of long-range thinking has been well incorporated into the science communities working on the Delta. There's still a lot of focusing on the immediate problems, the immediate policy issues, and not really doing enough about asking, well, if we do something now, how's that going to play out 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years into the future? And so that means, in order to do that, it means devoting some of your science resources to doing that kind of forward thinking. I know how hard that is when you're trying to drink from the fire hose. There's so many immediate issues pressing on you that you can't imagine how we can take any time away from just firefighting in order to put some people onto thinking of more longer term. But if you're going to deal with these things that are going to unfold into the future, I think it's really important that some of your science resources be put into that process. One of the things that may help with that is to imagine widening science career paths, particularly within the state agencies, where there's so much emphasis on the immediate and the here and now. At least when I was here, and I'm told this is still the case, if you're a scientist in the state agency, in order to move ahead, you have to go into administration. So it'd be nice if there was a clear advancement path for science within the state agencies so that you could develop and nurture some senior scientists who have that freedom, perhaps, to think forward. As I mentioned earlier, we think it's really going to be important to start planning for variability and extremes rather than imagining that tomorrow is going to be much like yesterday. We're all focused on protecting native species, and that's really important in the context of biodiversity conservation and living up to the expectations of the United Nations Convention on Biodiversity. But the fact of the matter is, around the world now, almost every ecosystem is very heavily invaded. And a lot of those invaders are useful. People like to fish for striped bass in the Delta. Largemouth bass fishery in the Delta is ranked very high among largemouth bass fishing areas in the United States. We think it's time to start putting at least some of your thought into, well, should we be managing any parts of the Delta to get maximum human benefit from some of these invasive species? I think I mentioned earlier, we think it's time to start exploring alternatives to conservation in place as your backup plan. You know, what's plan B if Delta smelt really do start to, as they seem to be, completely lose out in the Delta? Do we just say, well, too bad, we did our best, bye-bye Delta smelt? Or do you want to say, well, are there other alternatives for preserving that species? And is that the species you want to put your resources into? there are all sorts of really complex scientific, policy, and socioeconomic questions around alternatives to conservation in place. And so if you really want to have those options in your toolbox, you have to start thinking about it and talking about it now, so that when the time comes, you've worked your way through some of those problems. For example, if you were going to relocate Delta Smelt, where would you put them? What would the people in the relocation place think about that? And how would it impact on the ecosystem to which you might move them? Those are only 3 big issues that have to be taken into consideration if you're going to consider any kind of relocation alternative. Same is true of other kinds of alternatives like assisted evolution. With new genetic techniques, we might be able to manipulate some of these species to be able to adapt to some increase in temperature beyond their current acceptable range. Is that something that we want to do? They're currently trying to do this with some coral species to see if they can make them better adapted to increasing water temperatures, and so on. So we go through a number of these possibilities in our longer paper. We think it's important to invest in the development of some of these integrated models you were talking about in the previous discussion. It would be, we think, quite valuable to have forecasting models that are analogous to climate forecasting models that would let you explore the implications of some major management initiatives in the Delta. How would those play out? And would it result in the kind of Delta you actually want to have? As Cliff pointed out, there's a lot of modeling expertise here, and there are the foundations of doing this sort of thing, but it does need to be put together if it's going to be useful. And finally, we think it's important to include some investigation of Delta as an evolving place in the science enterprise. The need for integrating social science into the science was one of the items highlighted in the science enterprise, and this would be an example of that. Just a personal comment, when I began my science career in the mid-1960s, integration of social sciences with the natural sciences was being touted as the next big thing. So here we are, almost 50 years later, still saying, gee, we should think about integrating social science with the natural sciences. I spent a lot of my career trying to do this, and I know it's not easy to do. The fields speak different languages. They think differently about the problems. So it takes some effort. May take a champion, as Cliff suggested, but if you can make it work, then it is tremendously insightful. So I encourage you to pursue that. I think that's it. Yep.
Dr. Healy, thank you very much. I think what I'm going to do is move right on through to the Delta Renewed presentation, and then we can provide a time for questions. We're going to try and have this segment wrapped up around 4:15. So, Carl, your agency sponsored the three efforts, the three reports. The most recent is a Delta Renewed. So let's hear about this third and final installment in the Delta series.
Well, I'll keep this really brief and let Letitia go through it because that's where the important stuff is. But this has been an ongoing effort for really 10 years since the first ERP, Ecosystem Restoration Program grant, was awarded to SFEI to do the historical ecology of the Delta. And the work that they undertook is similar to work that I had experienced when I worked in San Francisco Bay on the Baylands ecosystem goals. And understanding the history and the ecological history of any place is critically important to being able to figure out what you might do in restoring or reconciling that habitat, particularly in a place like the delta, which is so dramatically changed from its historic condition. So this is the culmination of that effort, and it's really the tying together of what did the historical ecology provide to the species and habitats that we're interested in, and how and where you might look to reposition those in restoring the delta. And this also goes to the question of what is ecological restoration of the delta look like, which I think is an issue that's critical as we go forward in looking at the future of the delta. And as I'll touch on as part of my subsequent presentation about the conservation framework, is a key in moving that forward, but also in recognition of the delta as place, and how do you accommodate restoration of functionality and physical process as part within the web and context of the delta as it is today, and the socioeconomic interests within the delta, and maintaining a sustainable delta going forward. And I think particularly what we've heard from both the science enterprise and from the State of Science report is that we really need to be looking out. What do we expect this to look like, and what do we need to do to accommodate that in the future? So with that, I'll turn it over to Letitia to present on the Delta Renewed.
Thank you, Carl. Letitia, welcome.
Thanks. I'm really glad to be able to be here today and talk to you guys directly about this. I want to acknowledge all my co-authors and the science advisors. This is, as Carl was saying, a decadal-long process with lots of people, and I'm just sort of at the end of a chain of a lot of work. One thing I want to point out about this report, it's really not new science. It's science synthesis and translation to operationalize a lot of ideas, a lot of new ideas coming out of that historical ecology to actually do delta restoration. So this is intended to be useful and usable. So hopefully you will be able to use it. So looking at these three maps, this is the past, the present, and the potential future delta. And as Carl was getting at, what's new and interesting that this report brings is how the delta used to function historically when it was basically being managed by Native Americans around 1800. And if you look at that middle map, you can see that these are different land uses or habitat types, that it is so different than the historical map, nearly 100% different, that studying what we have today doesn't really help you understand how it used to work. And so that makes a really big challenge for how are you going to restore the functions that historic landscape used to provide, such as sustaining your native species. And so I think that's the key, interesting new aspect of this, and that's the new knowledge that's incorporated into this guidebook, this operationalized handbook for restoration. And so I included some quotes here from really important plans that you all have been a part of or have helped support to show that these ideas that we're going to present here are big, they're long-term, they may have felt like pie in the sky, maybe less now than they used to, but they've actually been called for. And it's acknowledged that we need this kind of large-scale landscape long-term thinking. So very quickly, I will give you some sense of what the historical delta was like before we go on to future restoration ideas. Here's a view looking down the Sacramento River. You can see it was a big wetland. That's a pretty big difference from now. It's been changed from a very productive wetland to a very productive agricultural area. And I want to point out that we have a great team of science advisors that were very involved every step of the way. I think we had 10 meetings. So they were advising us and keeping us to the best available science for the last 4 years on this project. And the way that we set up the project was to say, what is it that people want the Delta to do that it's not doing now? What are the functions that the Delta should provide that it's not providing now? And that's what those yellow squares are. You probably can't read them. I can't read them from here. Maybe in the audience you can read them on the big screens. But 5 of those functions are providing, supporting native wildlife, so different groups of wildlife like native fish or wildlife that live at the edge of the Delta or wildlife that live in marshes. And then the other three functions are more of that long-term adaptive resilience thinking. We want our food web to be robust and to support native species. We want our wildlife to be able to evolve over time. We know conditions are going to change. We don't want to have a zoo here that we have to completely manage. We actually want the biology to function the way it should. And we want to maintain biodiversity. So not just those 5 groups of wildlife, but we want to maintain that holistic biodiversity that's native to the Delta. And so based on that foundation, we then came up with metrics, things that you could actually measure in terms of change on the landscape that would tell you whether or not those functions are being supported. And don't worry, that's what's in pink. Don't worry about reading it. But that's what our second report was about. Randy has all the reports on his desk, and you can see they're getting thinner. We're trying to make them more accessible and usable over time. But this middle report was all about documenting, quantifying those metrics so that we could start to understand, why have we lost the function? Well, here's the metrics that show us the change, the amount of change over time that help us understand that loss. And so some examples are the extent of inundation, the size of marsh habitat patches, the distance to the nearest large marsh. If you're in a marsh, can you get to the next marsh? The riparian patch size of woody riparian areas, and then how much marsh do you have compared to how much open water? And I'll show you some examples of the extreme nature of the change in the Delta. So here's those 2 maps I showed you before with a little more information about what the colors are. And the main thing that I notice is that we've gone from that teal blue to pink, and that's just a change from tidal marsh or other kinds of freshwater emergent marsh to agriculture. And again, 2 highly productive uses of the land, one supporting native wildlife and the other supporting people. Although also wildlife can be supported in ag lands, and that's something that we start talking about a lot in this report. So now if you look at the bars on the right, you can see more or less how that trade-off has gone. Now there's a lot more complexity to it than just that, and I'm going to go through some of the details of what the landscape change means. So here we're starting to look at comparing historical flooding to modern flooding. So that's the extent of historical flooding in the Delta. All those different colors of blue were different kinds of flooding. And here's the extent of flooding now. And this is from the 1997 El Nino, when the Yolo bypass really flooded for a few days. So these are kind of like 2 very wet years that we're looking at. And what you can see is that big light blue in the middle, that was tidal flooding. So that was marshes getting wet once or twice a day. Very extensive tidal flooding. The really dark purpley blue at the top and the bottom, that was basin flooding, so it was pretty deep, a few feet deep. It lasted for a few months. It generated really active food webs that would go on. You could really get a complex food web going. A lot of animals could come down from the upland to eat. It would attract, huge amounts of predators. Aquatic species could get in there and eat. It was the refrigerator of California. And in the northern basin in Sacramento, the Sacramento River flooded at a different time than San Joaquin. So you can start to see that this is pretty complex. You have your daily flooding, you have your deep seasonal flooding, then you have light blue right around this sort of northwest edge of the Delta. You can see it somewhat paralleled by what the Yolo bypass did in 97. This is intermittent flooding. It might last a week or a few days. It goes on and off during the winter, spring. So there again, it's kind of a different habitat, a lot of wet meadows. So there again is another type of different flooding that actually connected several tributaries to the Delta. And so that was the mosaic of flooding that used to happen here, and it created a lot of productivity, it created a lot of options, a lot of places that animals could go. Now you see in the modern Delta, there's a little bit of flooding, there's a little bit of a short-term flooding in the yellow, also in the Casumnas that you can't see. And even though that looks like so little compared to historical, it's very successful. Think of all the good things we've heard about what's happening in those 2 areas where that kind of restoration work has been going on. So I find this to be a very extreme example of change, but also very hopeful that without a ton of land and without a ton of water, we can make change. And this is one of our best examples. And this is an experiment where they looked at how big fish were that grew in the floodplain of the channel up in the Casumnas. And you can see that the salmon did much better in the floodplain. So this gets at the food web properties or function that it provides. Now we're going to look at the change in marsh. So historical marsh, modern marsh, about a 98% loss. And I think this is something that maybe wasn't as appreciated as much until our historical ecology report came out. Delta was a big marsh. That's like the basic idea, kind of like the Louisiana Delta, like a lot of other deltas. And so it's so, when you lose 98% of something, it's so not there that it's hard to realize what it used to be like, or to study it, or to understand how it worked. So as you see this change in marsh, there's also a change in channels. It's a little hard to see, so I'm going to focus in on it now. This is the historical channel network. I'm looking at the San Joaquin mostly here. You can see that it's very squiggly, very capillary-like, just like your blood system works. And here's the modern channels. So you can see that there's a lot of the little capillaries are gone. There's a comparison where you can see the gray and the blue at once. And so what's happened here is that those little tiny channels, and these are actually really big, they're like 15 meters wide at the scale of the delta, but these smaller channels that used to bring water and energy and biota and sediment into the marshes are gone because the marshes are gone. And because of that, the system doesn't function the way it used to. It's not getting the energy and the nutrients it needs to keep the wetland going and to help support the species that evolved to live here. The other thing we've done is add these yellow channel cuts. So in addition to getting rid of those little capillary channels, we've kind of homogenized the big channels. We've made them straighter. We've made them more connected. The water moves through them more quickly. We've taken something that used to be a complex system with a lot of different habitat types very close to each other, and we've made basically these sort of linear connected lakes that are all very similar to each other. And so it's not a surprise that it's very hard for something that involved in a marsh to have a challenge living in this big homogeneous linear lake. And I think that's a good insight to get from our work. I'm going to take a step back and just say some of the ideas that we applied to this came from an exercise that we did, and you guys all have a copy of this report in front of you. It's the smallest thing that we handed out to you, I think. Thanks, Randy. Where we looked at landscape resilience around the world. This is an issue that people are starting to wonder, how in this time of climate change and other rapid change are we going to get the functions we want from our landscapes? And there's a huge body of academic research, but it's pretty esoteric out in the world of ecology. And even I read these papers as an ecologist and think, is this real? I don't know. And so we tried to bring that all together with the real academics who wrote these papers and got them to try to make it operational with us, got them to make it real and applicable to a real landscape. And so that's what this framework is, and we applied it to our Delta work to make sure that we weren't getting lost in the local challenges, but we were remaining open to that wider global literature and making sure we were using the best available science. And so this framework has 7 principles, and we incorporated them all into what's come out in our new Delta Renewed report. And so they are setting. You have to take the right kinds of actions in the right kind of places. And we've already seen that that doesn't happen on every restoration project, but this is a key idea that needs to come into very early thinking. Process. What are the big physical processes that are needed to make this site resilient over time? Are you going to have a tidal marsh without tidal action? Probably not. Are you going to have a tidal marsh without some kind of sediment supply if sea level rise is happening? Probably not. Connectivity, can your creatures get from one place to another? Are you connected enough? Are you overconnected? Your linear lakes are overconnected. Maybe you need to underconnect some of your habitats. Diversity and complexity, going away from the more homogenized landscape to the more heterogeneous, complicated landscape. Redundancy, this was a tough one for the Delta. How are we going to have more than one migration route for salmon? That's hard. But we know from the literature that that's really important, especially in the light of stochastic events. We heard from the Science Enterprise Workshop and the Bay Delta Science Update that we actually need to be prepared for these really big events, and it's something we haven't thought as much about as we have about the slow change. Scale, we probably have to do things bigger and longer term than we're used to. We're not set up to fund it that way. We're not set up to permit it that way. How are we going to do that? And then people. People are the most important part. What do people want? What are the goals? That's really, more up to you than the scientists to figure out. And what can we do to accommodate those goals? How can we fit in ecology to social and economic needs? So based on all that, we came up with a really, really simple conceptual model that historically we had intact physical processes. And by that, I mean these big land surface processes. We had flows, we had flooding, we had sediment supply. And those acted on the landscape, which was still fairly intact. We had large swaths of natural habitats that were connected to each other appropriately. And out of that, we got ecological functions, huge salmon runs, large wildlife populations, etc. Well, now we've interrupted a lot of the physical processes. So we don't have all the flows and the flooding and the sediment supply. We've really changed the landscape to different land uses. We have, for the most part, smaller, more isolated and different types of habitats, and we're not getting the ecological functions we want. So the idea is, rather than just going right to the landscape and restoring some patches, what we need to do is restore those processes that will create and sustain the patches, the habitats over time. Without that, we're not going to get resilience in the long term. Things are changing too much. We don't want to be managing every aspect of the environment. We want habitats to evolve, and again, this came out of the science presentations you've heard before as well. Then we also, though, do have to address the landscape. We need to make larger, more connected habitat patches, and this is how we can get back ecological functions. And I just want to point out, this doesn't look like the historical situation. This is a new situation where we still have ag and water exports from the Delta, but we also get back more of the functions we want ecologically. So that brings us to the report in front of you with the dark gray green cover, Delta Renewed. And the idea here is we try to put it all together and say, if we want a certain function, how do we get it back? So for example, this one is about supporting marsh wildlife. And we provide a map of the kinds of habitats that you would put back together in the kinds of places with the kinds of adjacency and relative size, things like that. This is probably an overemphasis of the patch size, just so you can see all the parts. And you can see that there's a lot of different things going on. There's tidal marsh restoration, there's also subsidence reversal, and there's a lot of wildlife-friendly ag. So it's not just one habitat or another, it's a systems approach. It's putting back together a system that works to provide a function. And then at a more, that was intended to be the full delta, if that wasn't clear to everybody. It's intended to be the full delta without saying where any one parcel could possibly be, but gives you a sense of what should happen in the north, what should happen in the south. But then at the more localized scale of someone trying to implement a project, we say, well, what are the strategies you would put together at a very local scale, and how would they fit together? And these strategies, we spend a lot of time explaining what they are. They're all process-based. They're all about returning processes rather than restoring static habitat types. So we have several pages on the processes, and for example, this one is about reestablishing tidal processes. So this would be, you have to think about full tidal flows, enough energy, sediment supply. Those are the kinds of processes that happen in the tidal zone. I think this is page 45. I see people flipping because this is not readable at that scale. But what you can see is that we provide a map that says, okay, here's the landscape scale considerations you should have. This one is a lot about where's the right elevation. You don't want to restore a tidal marsh at the wrong elevation. It doesn't work. It has to be at the intertidal elevation. But we know sea level's rising, so we can plan ahead, and we can look to elevations that are 3 feet higher or 6 feet higher than sea level is right now. And when you do that, you realize, oh, there's a lot of opportunity. It's not all on public land right now, but there's a lot of land out there. And we are seeing more opportunities on public land coming up. So this is intended to help people think about where is an appropriate place to get started with this. If I'm a manager or practitioner, actually, I'm going to do eco-restore. Where should I do it? Where should I think about making it happen? And then we try to get even finer scale and give some targeted information, because people want to know, how big should my marsh be? How far can it be from another marsh? What shape and size should it be? What do you really mean by these physical processes? So the orange recommendations are all explain parameters for the physical process, and the green recommendations explain parameters for the landscape. And so one example here is, here's a guideline for reestablishing marsh patches. And the idea is that marshes should be as large as possible. They're very, very small right now. Well, what does that mean? We as scientists can't tell you how large you want your marshes, but we can tell you, if you restore different sized patches, what might you get back in terms of function? And so, for example, for a 4-hectare marsh, that's about what you have right now in terms of patch size. And you might get a marsh bird showing up, like a black rail. You might get tricolored blackbird nesting if you have just the right thing. But if you get up to 100 hectares, then you're reaching the maximum density of certain marsh bird species. So that's showing that at the biological level, you're getting a process going that's working. But if you get to 500 hectare patch size, which feels big right now, I think, compared to what we have, that's when you get that dendritic network of capillary-like channels going in and out of your marsh. And that's more of a self-sustaining functional marsh system that's going to have the energy and sediment supply to potentially keep up with sea level rise, where you won't have to be constantly managing it or trying to bring it along with sea level. Now, is that the same as historical? No, historical patch sizes were about 4,500 hectares. So there is a real difference between getting back to what we had before and getting the functions back that we want in a smaller footprint. And just because I think it's amazing, the largest marsh patch was 110,000 hectares, which is really a lot. It's kind of bigger than our cities. So I'll leave you with this idea. This is what the Delta looked like before. It's a really different place now. And we think there is a way to make a future Delta that can reconcile the ecological functions we want with the economic and social needs that we have. And my request of this committee is to really use this. It's not intended to be a piece of science to sit on the shelf. It's intended to be brought down, and it's a guide to use. And we actually have been able to secure some more funding to make an even shorter, more condensed version early next year. So as you guys are working on Eco Restore or McCormick-Williamson Tract or other big new exciting opportunities on public lands, we hope that you can bring this in.
Letitia, thank you very much. Carl, thank you. Panelists, I'd like to offer some questions from the committee if there are any. Two compelling reports. Okay, panelists, thank you very much. Appreciate the summary of both of those reports. Carl, you're doing double duty today. You are serving on the next panel as well. We're on to file item number 4, ecosystem restoration progress. As it has been our habit for the last several meetings, we are going to now highlight successes and progress being made on the ecosystem restoration front. Carl will be talking about the Delta Conservation Framework that's underway. David Okita will be updating us on progress on the California Eco Restore projects, and Christopher Chernell will update us on the Yolo Bypass partnership work. Gentlemen, welcome. Carl, why don't you lead off, since you're the veteran of the three there.
Thank you, Randy. So this is something that I'm quite excited about, and I think builds appropriately off of the Delta Renewed and historical ecology work. And as you mentioned in your opening remarks, this is an effort to kind of lay out a future as it related to many of the conservation measures that were identified in the BDCP. And what do we do with those? Because they're not addressed under the water fix. And this is an effort that the department has taken on under Chuck's leadership to lay that out. We're doing it on a very tight time frame. We have champions for this. Two of our staff people, Brooke Jacobs and Christina Sloop, are doing the heavy lifting on this to move it along. We've been partnering with many of our other state agencies in developing the framework and trying to engage as many people as possible, recognizing that we don't always get to everybody, but we're trying, and anybody that is interested is certainly welcome to come and talk to us, and we're there to talk with them. So the framework is looking out and intended to be a vision for what could be done in the Delta, not any specific mandate. It's a very high-level look at things as far as where you could do things, priorities. It's going to depend more on sub-regional planning, so it's setting an overall tone and using documents like Delta Renewed as a guidebook on how you would do what you might be interested in doing in any particular geographic portion of the Delta, recognizing that the Delta is a very diverse place physically and socioeconomically, and so different things are going to happen in different settings depending on what the local community is interested in doing in cooperation with others and in addressing their broader issues, whether it's flood control or flood management, recreational development, habitat restoration, and those kinds of things. So, and I guess I should be pushing the buttons to make this go forward. So with that, we've developed a vision for the future of the Delta. And that vision has been developed, with input through workshops. We're managing this with monthly workshops with interested stakeholder participation to develop this. It's not something that we're off developing by ourselves. We generally send out some groundwork or some first cut at an effort, and then within the workshop framework, flesh it out to represent the interests of the participants in the process. So first of all, the vision for the Delta, a mosaic of towns, agricultural landscapes, managed wetlands, and resilient ecosystems where people prosper and healthy fish, wildlife, and plant communities thrive. And the same with the purpose of the effort, which is intended to set the tone for a forum of local engagement of resource managers, scientists, local residents in the Delta, other interested organizations and agencies that are focused on the interests of the Delta and the values of the Delta, whether they're from a biological perspective or from an agricultural perspective or whatever. Oh yeah, that would be great. Thank you. I can't do two things at once. And part of this is developing a shared vision and overarching goals and strategies for the Delta. And out of that, developing potential solutions that can be moved forward, particularly in a more regional context. And I think, we look for most of this to be implemented going forward in a regional construct using regional planning efforts that the Delta Conservancy has engaged or taken first steps to move forward, and probably the primary example of that kind of effort is what's going on with the YOLO partnership. Initially in the YOLO bypass and now expanded to include cash slew. These are critical. From the Delta Renewed report, you see, very clearly the importance of those areas in helping to restore function within the Delta. This is a prime area that we can take those kinds of actions as opposed to other parts of the Delta that are really compromised from a restoration perspective, depending on what kind of restoration you're interested in. And this goes to the question of, we talk about ecosystem restoration, and it's a goal of the Delta Reform Act, but ecosystem restoration is complicated by what's there today and what we have the ability to restore or bring back or enhance in the system as opposed to putting it back to something that it might have been before. The principles of the planning effort are to focus on conservation of Delta ecosystems that will benefit both people and the environment and build community, promote ecological function. That's what we heard about from Letitia. Providing multiple benefits. I think, there are many things in the Delta, and we've heard for a long time about wildlife-friendly agriculture. I'm still, to this day, unclear exactly what that is. And to some degree, I hope that through the framework, we'll be able to better define that so that people can understand moving forward what that looks like. and focusing on people and place. That's a key component of the Delta Reform Act, and the kind of the prime modifier of the co-equal goals is the Delta as place. And Mary Pifo talked about the importance of that in the heritage designation and the efforts to do that. And this planning process, or this effort in developing the framework, that's a key principle as we move forward. I think within the construct of within the construct of Delta conservation, this recognizes that, as I've discussed before, the need to engage stakeholders in the integration of a number of actions that might be undertaken, and the types of activities that can be pursued. And I think coming out of this effort, we have probably a good example that we'll be able to present that's focused primarily on public lands that can serve as a guide for how you might move forward in conducting this. And I think a key thing that's come out in the past presentations, both from the Science Enterprise and from the State of Bay Delta Science, is that we have to be looking out. This currently looks out 25 years. Well, probably would be better to maybe look at 50, because really planning for something today that's not going to be there tomorrow in a changing world with climate change and the effects that may engender within the Delta is not productive. So I think this is really kind of laying the trajectory for how we might proceed with things and accounting for those changes into the future. The planning context, we've been trying to build on previous planning efforts to the maximum extent possible. We're not trying to create anything new. From this diagram, you can see how we've tried to bring things together so that this document can service a multiple of needs, both from the perspective of guiding potential future funding efforts, say through Prop 1 by the Department and the Conservancy, through greenhouse gas fund expenditures for carbon sequestration in the Delta and for other efforts. And also to, as I mentioned, to help support these regional conservation strategies that we hope will emerge from the efforts of local groups within the Delta on a geographic basis, recognizing the differences there. So far, we've had broad stakeholder participation. We've done active outreach. We've moved at varying paces and may not have caught up with everybody, but we've touched base with many, particularly our federal counterpart, Fish and Wildlife agencies, to check in with them. We haven't involved them to a great degree because they're very stretched as far as their capacity to participate. But we have based much of the planning that we have done and much of the work on previous efforts that have engaged them to a high degree, as well as looking at recovery plans that are currently in place or being developed, so that we're trying to account for all of those efforts. We've stayed away from flows and are focused primarily on habitat constituents and the functions, and not just fish, but all of the species that were potentially addressed in BDCP. So there were 47, and I think, or 54, and of that, 40 plus were terrestrial species and plants, and focusing on the natural communities that were addressed. So we have ongoing further outreach. We're presenting to the Delta Protection Commission at their meeting on Thursday in Knightson. And just as a side, there's a great little project being plan in Knightson that really takes many of the elements of historical ecology, potential ecosystem restoration into account, and I'm pretty excited about it. And they're just getting off the ground there. But I hope this will serve as an example of a type of multi-benefit project that can address a number of needs going forward, and something that can be funded from Prop 40 once it's ready to go, and is a locally based project. We don't have many of those as it relates to restoration within the Delta. So quite a bit of outreach there. We're also working with North Delta Cares and other groups. We have a meeting with the 5 Delta Counties Coalition coming up this week as well. So looking for as much input as we can. We have a steering committee that has participation of the local agencies as we go forward and plan our workshops and do our work. And they've been extremely helpful in moving this process along. I touched on consistency with existing plans, conservation topics, again, integration of community and functional Delta ecosystems. We've talked quite a bit about that earlier. And, the overarching goals, touched on those previously, integrate regular stakeholder communication, reliance on, particularly stakeholder engagement through regional planning going forward to really come down with what it gets implemented at the end of the day. And really building on the types of efforts that are currently underway with Eco-Restore. So this is kind of beyond Eco-Restore. It's not accounting for Eco-Restore, but where you go from there. And I'm going to skip along really quickly and just get to the stakeholder engagement. We've had 3 workshops. They've been monthly. The first one was September, and we're coming up on our 4th and final, which will be in Walnut Grove on the 30th. And we'll be looking at focusing on kind of regional priorities and possibilities in that, working with stakeholder groups through breakout groups to look at specific areas within the Delta where we can kind of lay out some visions or some ideas about what can be done. And so that will be the final of our workshops, and then we'll be working on developing a draft report targeted for completion early in the new year, and then out for public review and engagement. And then looking at finalizing that, the primary focus of this is to support the Delta Stewardship Council's Delta Plan update as it relates to the ecosystem and restoration components of the plan. So with that.
Carl, great. Again, we'll hold off questions until we've heard from all 3 presenters. David?
And sorry, Randy, just before we go on to David and Chris's presentation, I wanted to actually go back to the start of Carl's presentation. If we could go to one of the first 2 slides. One of the objectives of this meeting was to really create a narrative for everyone here about how these pieces are fitting together. So if we could just quickly go back to that. There is one slide that I just want to flash up, and it provides good context for how these pieces fit together. So we heard about the Delta Renewed report and the State of Bay Delta Science, and how the scientific support from those documents are really supporting the planning structure that Carl just explained for the Delta Conservation Framework. He mentioned a little bit about the upcoming Delta Plan Ecosystem Amendment and how that will be a policy document that will also help support implementation overall. And what we're going to switch to quickly is discussion on Eco-Restore and all the progress that's being made there. But there's also several other efforts that are going on right now that really fall in the category of implementation, operations, and management, and adaptive management. So Eco-Restore, Campbell Ingram will talk a little bit about the regional conservation strategies.
of course, Yellow Bypass, and then also there's a lot going on in terms of implementation of Prop 1 bond funding and DWR's RFP that came out recently to support ecosystem restoration. So I just want to keep that in mind as we go through the next set.
Thank you.
So with that.
Okay, thank you. Let me get to the Eco Restore slides. There are three components to Eco Restore. Let me get to those. The projects themselves, and Chris and I will be showing you some neat pictures of projects actually under construction. And, oops. They're helping you. Okay.
Planning is another function, and Campbell will be talking a little bit about the regional strategies, and Carl just talked about the Delta Conservation Framework, which is an important part of planning. The third piece is adaptive management, and I did want to talk a little bit about that because you heard a lot today about science and adaptive management on a broad Delta-wide scale. What we're trying to do in Eco Restore is implement a subset of that adaptive management for just Eco Restore projects in the Delta and Suisun Marsh. So what we are planning to do is actually implement an adaptive management program in the next couple of years. And I'm an engineer, so think of this in terms of designing and constructing an adaptive management program. We have plenty of the science tools that are out there to put together, but in the context of state government and the stakeholders we have, how do we actually implement this thing? Staffing, funding, where it is in state government, how do we involve our federal and local partners? So that's what we're working on right now. We have a steering committee that's providing some policy guidance. We have a technical committee that prepared a very thorough paper about how this program should look. If money was not a constraint, all the things that we should be doing. The gaps in what we're not doing now. We're actually doing quite a bit, but there are some gaps. So we have the tools to put this thing together, and what we want to do in the next year or so is actually start this program. It'll probably be incremental and build up to ultimately what we want to do, but at least it's a start. So that's what we're doing in adaptive management. Now a little bit more about the projects. The goal is 30,000 acres made up of different types of habitats, tidal marsh, managed wetlands and floodplain, and also fish passage improvements, which are not acreage-based, and also setback levees, which is measured in mileage of levee setbacks. Here's a map showing the different projects. I'm not going to go into those. They're in your packet. We do have 2 projects under construction right now, and we have a couple more that may do some pre-construction activities this year, but we'll actually start construction next year, and a whole slew of projects in 2018 and 2019, and you can go through those yourselves. In terms of the tidal wetland projects, the goal is 9,000 acres, and we also have within that 8,000 acres for the Delta Smelt Biological Opinion. Here's a list of projects that are either under construction or plan to be construction in the next few years. And it does not include projects that we anticipate getting through our request for proposal process, which I'll go into next. But you can see the numbers add up getting pretty close to 8,000, 9,000 acres. And with the RFP, we could be in a position of luxury where we can pick and choose which projects make the most sense to meet those requirements. I mentioned before the RFP projects. We expect these to come in 2017, and we have a process involving many of your agencies in help evaluating these projects to find out which ones should be picked for implementation, and we hope to add those to the total that you saw in the previous slides. Now for some specific projects. Tule Red Restoration Project started construction this fall, a couple months ago, and it is the first project to count towards the 8,000 acres of the Delta Smelt Biological Opinion. We had to clear a lot of hurdles in getting this thing permitted in the Suisun Marsh, and the hurdles that we completed should be helpful in permitting future projects in the Suisun Marsh. And then I will turn it over to Chris, who will talk about some of the projects in the Yellow Bypass.
Okay, good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be back. Again, I'm Chris Trinnell with the California Natural Resources Agency. I just have 3 slides. I just want to highlight several of the projects that are moving forward. In the Yellow Bypass specifically, there's obviously a lot more going on out there. David touched on some of that, so it's certainly not constrained by what I'm going to be talking about, but definitely wanted to highlight several of those that, at least in the neck of the woods, that I seem to be spending a lot of my time working in, are moving forward. Wallace Weir Fish Rescue Facility, Well, what a difference 6 months makes. 4,320 little hours. Last time I was here 6 months ago, this project was in permitting, and through the absolutely incredible commitment by each of the agencies that's represented up here, we have moved from planning through permitting and are halfway through construction and plan to be completing construction by mid-December. And that's all in a one-year timeline, which I think, as we're all pretty aware of, in this particular landscape, really is just indicative of the situation that we find ourselves in Delta-wide is pretty remarkable. So a huge thank you to each of the agencies that had a role in either implementing or permitting or both this particular project. So really quickly, this is a fish passage project. It's one of those interesting fish passage projects where we're actually trying to block fish passage. But the key there is that we're trying to block it. We're trying to block fish passage to hinder their ability to go where they should not to go, and in doing so facilitate them staying in the places that are more amenable to their movement or rearing or other types of important habitat areas. This one prevents straying into the Colusa Basin drain. Some of the details are here. Again, it's under construction, current challenges. It's a very tight construction window. So two things. First, it's a very tight construction window. We have to get done by mid-December. Obviously, the sooner the better. Rains, as far as this project go, are not a good thing. Obviously, we want them to happen this year, but as somebody, I believe, on the panel mentioned to begin with, I think that was maybe you, Felicia, there's a balance to be found there. And there was a big risk a couple weeks ago that this project was actually going to get flooded out when that first set of big storms came through. And the team, led by Reclamation District 108, who's been taking the lead on this project and doing a fantastic job, actually built a berm around the entire footprint of the project. And we all did our parts at the policy level and crossed our fingers. And fortunately, the project did not get swept away. It is there, and we are on track to finishing it on time. So again, a big thanks to each of you for the work that each of your agencies did to really make that happen. It was pretty incredible and remains that way. Second project, this is really what I view as the next one in the pipeline, if you will. This is called the Fremont Weir Adult Fish Passage Project. This is going to take the current fish ladder that exists in the Fremont Weir and make it more functional from an ecological perspective. It's going to make it slightly wider, it's going to make it slightly deeper, and in doing so it will have a broader and more effective window of time that it will allow adult fish, mostly salmonids and sturgeon, to move northward through the bypass on their journey back into the main stem of the Sacramento River. This project is led by Department of Water Resources and the Bureau of Reclamation, of course. Again, this is another one that is consistent with and really in furtherance of the 2009 NIMS biological opinion. We are aiming for construction next year. So this one falls in the same category as the Wallace Weir Fish Rescue Facility, which is it's going to take everything to really get this done, if not next year, even the year after, but at least to get it started next year. This is a significantly more challenging project, but it is nowhere near as challenging as the project I'll talk about next. So really it's an intermediate step, really testing the limits of, maybe not the limits, hopefully not the limits, it's testing the frameworks that we're setting up for interagency coordination and communication. Expected challenges on this project: permitting timelines, construction timelines, interagency coordination. Again, all the same stuff, but really just ramped up a little bit. And leads me to the last project I just mentioned. This is really the big kahuna out there in the Yolo Bypass, and it's been referenced by multiple panelists so far. This is, in short, how do we cut a notch into the Fremont Weir so that we increase the frequency and duration of ecologically functional floodplain inundation. So it is a big project, has the potential to impact the agricultural sector, has the potential to impact existing wildlife areas that are out there already. It's incredibly challenging from an engineering perspective, and it's incredibly engineering from a societal perspective, to be frank. There's a lot of existing uses out there. The bypass is used, of course, first and foremost as a flood control facility, so there's flood component considerations that have to be made, but it's also hugely important to Yolo and Solano counties economically, a huge recreational component out there. but we will get it done. Again, another project that's led by DWR and the Bureau of Reclamation for the purposes of compliance with the biological opinion, 2009 biological opinion. We are expecting a public draft EIR/EIS in late summer of 2017. That will be a huge accomplishment and something that, again, will require each of the agencies, for the most part up here, to do something extra special when it comes to coordination, communication, and a commitment to moving this along with a planned rod nod a year later in summer of 2018, and hopefully moving through permitting and construction soon thereafter. So, one other thing I want to mention about this one, early and regular engagement of key stakeholders. So there's about 100 plus individual land ownerships out there in the Yola bypass that could be affected by this project. That's a whole lot of folks. And we will be clearly engaging each and every one of those, as we should, through the normal CEQA NEPA process. But in advance of that, we have it's called the Yola Bypass Working Group that's set up now. It's a subset of those landowners, local agencies, state agencies, federal agencies to really work through some of the key issues. Expected challenges getting to yes. This is a big one, very challenging. We have to figure out how to really achieve what Carl asked a major question about, which is, can we really achieve on this particular landscape functional ecosystems working in literally on the same land as functional economies? And it's a big question. I think the answer to the question is yes, we can, and we certainly should, and we're working through the how. So again, a big challenge, a lot of good work being done. Looking forward to working with each of you on that. So, and of course, happy to answer any questions about that. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, all three.
Did you want me to explain this project tracking matrix now or later? Or?
Yeah, does this go to the DPIIC request? Yeah, maybe Jessica could set that up, and then David,
Sure.
you could bring it home.
And also, Campbell, maybe you can just spend a minute or two just talking about the regional conservation strategies that Conservancy is working on, because it dovetails quite nicely with all this work.
Certainly. Actually very happy to report that after quite an effort and a lot of contracting and a lot of just getting everyone on the same page, we have actually started the Cashley Regional Restoration Planning effort. You've heard about the Delta Conservation Framework at the high level. We've talked a little bit about the Delta Renewed process. This is taking that information and starting to drill down on a specific region to try to the best of our ability to take what we do know and determine where do we do restoration to the greatest effect, but with the least amount of impact on the local land use. So we've brought together the counties, the Reclamation District, the Water District, as well as many state and federal agencies, and a bevy of consultants to help us take a look at the most readily available information in a relatively quick first pass. Try to identify from a scientific basis how and why we want to do restoration in this area and what is it that we want to accomplish, and then work with the local interest at the table to overlay that with the agricultural situation. Where are the water intakes? Where are the drainage issues, as well as the flood protection system? And again, in an effort to try to come out at it with a regional perspective of where we most likely can do good restoration with the least amount of impact, and therefore then have the greatest local support for the effort that we're going to try, for the restoration that we're going to try to do, and then therefore just increase our chances of effective implementation over time. So it is an exciting, it's sort of a cascade. You see the Regional Conservation Framework, all informed by the Delta Renewed base information, and then starting to drill down and work with locals to really get at what it is we think we can achieve. That was very fast. Just one other thing I did want to mention on the restoration side as well. Our Proposition 1 grant program we ran last year, we funded 9 projects for $6.3 million. We're in the middle of our second solicitation right now. We'll take to our board recommendations for our concept proposals next Monday, and there's 11 projects there requesting $15 million this year. And it's a nice broad suite of projects with restoration, water quality, watershed, and even some ag sustainability projects as well. So again, I think you start to see a cascade of how everything's working together on the restoration front. Thank you.
Okay, I'll turn it over to David to talk about the project tracking matrix, and then we can go from there on the committee discussion.
Okay, if you could put that slide back up. This is a matrix that DWR has put together that shows a timeline for restoration projects. You only see 4 here, but we actually have 10 more, but we didn't want to put that on this one slide. And we'll be adding more as they come into being, such as through the RFP process. But if you look at going across, it has different colored bars for different phases of project implementation.
David, excuse me, it's in the binder.
Right.
It's second to the last page under this file tab.
Right. And there are kind of 2 purposes for this. One is to help determine the staffing needs and the funding needs for all these projects seen in a time frame. And also, a second one is having to do with permitting. We've included little marks of different letters showing different agencies' permits and when they're needed. So you can see in the context of these 4 projects and eventually another 10 or 15 more, when projects are going to be needed for these, when permits are going to be needed for these different projects. And you can see it can be quite a big deal to get the resources from these different agencies to commit to processing these permits. So that was the purpose of putting this together.
Okay, so there is a request, or one could call it a recommendation, on the next page. Jessica, would you or David
Sure.
or
I think
who
we
would
can-
like to present this request to the decision makers at the table?
Sure. So the request is in line with a lot of what we've been hearing about today, which is the need for champions, the need for really interagency effort to move things forward, and I think an overarching sense that we need to get things done in the Delta. So what we're proposing here is a process. And a process to build over the next 6 months between now and the next DPIIC meeting. So the request is really to have this matrix that's being developed by DWR, to send it to all the agencies, to ask you to review the matrix from your own agency's perspective, and to work internally to understand what resources and or policy changes are needed to support the Eco-Restore implementation over the next 3 years. So it's a 5-year program. You're about 1.5 years through. That gives about another 3.5 years to really move the projects forward, if I'm understanding it correctly. And then to come back at the next DPIIC meeting, April 17th, 2017, and report back on interagency internal review, and then based on those report results at our next meeting, discuss where DPIIC, this group, overall can be helpful in further removing some barriers and implementing best practices. David or Chris, would you like to, is there anything to add to that?
I think Chuck has a
Or Chuck,
comment.
yeah.
So I have a request. It's one of the few so far in these meetings to my colleagues here. And perhaps this is too much sharing, but at this point in my career, what the heck? There were many naysayers when Eco-Restore was launched. And I think people read their worst fears into it, whatever those fears may have been. It's possible to actually do stuff. It just takes our collective will. And I think the last 18 months and these 3 gentlemen in the prior panels prove that. So, assuming we continue to have the structure that involves local input, assuming we find the right place to do projects big or small, it's going to come to us on the question of policy changes and managing through that matrix that was just up there, or we won't get any of it done. If you can do these projects, no one can ever take it away from us. So I would just ask that we come back to the next DPIIC meeting, having in each of us take a look at that matrix and facilitated that kind of breaking down the barriers, teeing up we'll need to engage in. I feel like I'm a milk carton with an expiration date. The administration has a defined time frame left at the state level. If we don't get them done, they're not done, and we should do these projects. So,
Carla? Welcome.
Thank you. I just
agree wholeheartedly with everything Chuck just said. I think we can be that informal here. And I would just also say I've been a little down in the dumps. The last week has been kind of rough, but it's great to listen to all the pieces, I think, starting to come together. And, you know, my experience is there's a lot of folks in our agencies and departments that have tremendous expertise and are just really energized and glad to make their expertise very relevant to projects and advancing the goals I think we are all embracing around the table. And my hope is that we can, especially considering an administration that you know, can start to see a little bit of the finish line, that we're going to have folks in our departments who are pretty well focused. They know what it's like to get projects done. They know what it's like working with other agencies in a way that we really haven't managed in the Delta for at least a good decade, maybe longer. So thanks to all of you folks, and if anyone around the table hasn't been to one of Chris Chernell's or David Okita's, or Nancy Vogel works a lot for us at agency on assembling some of these kind of ribbon cuttings. But we've had, I personally have very much valued the opportunity that provides me in meeting with all the local folks that are really stepping up to partner. And they're also very motivated. Nobody knows the landscape out there really like they do. And we've gotten, I think that's absolutely why we've been as successful on these first few projects that we have. So thanks to everyone who's really leaning in.
Okay, so the matrix that is in the binder represents 4 projects. That's going to be populated with another 10
About 10 or 12.
10 or 12. And that'll be ready when?
December.
Okay. So in December, a heads up, every agency around the table, plus the Army Corps, who is not here today, and it looks like Bureau of Lands or State Lands Commission should be on that list as well. By April, we're going to want to hear from all of you how you're going to help facilitate bringing these 14 projects to a swift and sure completion. Is that, we all in agreement on that? Okay. This is perhaps maybe the most important project that DPIIC has entertained in some time. And the momentum of the success that has occurred thus far should give everybody encouragement that this is a worthy endeavor to support. So we will, from the Stewardship Council, do our part to reach out to these other agencies as well. But I don't see any dissent around the table. So we're fully committed to this. All right, very good. Now's your opportunity to ask the presenters any questions that you would like now that we've got that decision.
And just a quick note on Army Corps, representative tried to make it out, got stuck in horrendous traffic from the Bay Area and is watching online. So they are engaged in the meeting.
Hi, Army Corps.
Yeah.
Any, Mary?
Just a comment, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to thank and recognize the leadership that is occurring in order for all these actions to come together, and emphasize again the importance of working with the local landowners, the local community members, the local Delta counties. And I know you're doing that outreach. You're making those connections and having those community forums are just extremely important. And I want to keep encouraging you to keep at it. Thank you.
Okay, Bill.
Randy, I'd just say, based on our experience at the Wallace Weir and the K-Log project, it's very helpful to most of us, or at least it is to me, to, as these timelines get finalized, they always are moving around. And if you're in the process of setting up a meeting to approve a permit, it's helpful to me to have Chris, yelling at us over the phone all the time and making sure that it gets on the agenda in a timely manner, and we can do that. But, we've got a lot on our plate, and the process of trying to track these timelines as they move, as they change, is hard. So I appreciate the phone calls and the yelling and so on and getting it done, and that's helpful. We need to do that.
Well, we have champions for implementation, that's clear. And David and Chris and Carl represent those champions. Now we need some champions on the permitting side, and that'll come from every agency around this table. So I look forward to some good reports in April. Jessica, yes, please.
This is one of those things I would gladly dedicate resources to. I just want to say, for the record, that I now have my hope and my inspiration between this and Letitia's. I don't know when I'm going to read this, but I want to. Just a sense of what the art of the possible is and expanding our sense of it, but also seeing things actually happen. So I've got my hope, my inspiration, thanks to Jessica. I got my caffeine too, which was also important for attitude, I just have to say, if nothing else. But so this was great. Thank you. Happy to engage.
Karen?
So I just had a question, and maybe they're not on this list of stakeholders because they're not relevant, but I'm just wondering about the Natural Resource Conservation Service and USDA being a part of this. They can bring some cost share dollars for on the land. They might also help you, Cliff, get to a definition that's acceptable on wildlife-friendly farming. And so I'm just wondering if there is a role or if there has been coordination to help bring some additional landowner enthusiasm.
I'm looking at staff, and yeah, we have talked with NRDC, or not NRDC,
That's
but
the other NR.
National
Yeah, okay.
Natural Resource Conservation Districts and reclamation districts as well to get that kind of input, and they're part of our outreach effort while they don't show up on the...
Okay, because I noticed you also have a couple RCDs, and that's also a boots on the ground
Mm-hmm.
technical
Yes.
assistance as well. Okay.
Paul?
Thanks for your work. It's just great to see stuff getting done. It's great. Wonderful. So when we're done with these 14, are we finished, or is there a broader vision for this? The next wave. Okay.
Yeah, and the conservation framework that Carl described is leading towards the longer-term goals for restoration, which will become a part of an amendment to the Delta Plan to create some legacy for those decisions and recommendations that go well beyond political administrations.
So,
yes, Carl.
just to respond to that, Paul, I think there are some things that are emerging from the resiliency strategy that would potentially build on this in the context of the framework. So, Eco-Restore is, kind of this administration, and there's more to be done. And I think we can highlight some specific recommendations, particularly in the framework as it goes forward, particularly as it relates to public lands.
Okay, good. Other comments? Yes, Chris.
If I could just say one last thing. I just really appreciate the conversation around the matrix and the commitment to doing some self-reflection on what that's going to take. I think it's really fashionable to point to the permitting process as the problem. I think that's a tremendous mistake. I certainly know where I am weakest in my professional life and other places. And I imagine that, yeah. And I just really look forward to the honest assessment of our own agency's roles, responsibilities, and where we can all improve. So thank you for taking that tack.
Mm-hmm. The record, the one part of this meeting that makes no sense to me is envisioning Chris Turnell yelling at someone, as opposed to being charmingly and forcefully persuasive.
Carl, your red light's on.
Yeah, just one more thing. As a follow-up to that, I think one thing we hope to address within the framework is this issue of permitting. And I think there's some hopeful efforts underway, particularly in San Francisco Bay, which I hope we can bring up into the Delta that would help to streamline the permitting process, particularly as it relates to 404 and some of the other permitting processes, which I think, for me personally, having worked in regulation most of my career, making permits happen is something that's critical, and and I think is important to regulators. They like to see things happen that are good for the environment, but it's a struggle, and I'm hoping we can come up with some solutions for that.
Thanks. Erin?
Yeah, thank you for your presentation and for providing all the good news. I just wanted to respond quickly to Carl's comment and to say that EPA Region 9 is having conversations in the San Francisco Bay Area for a regional general monitoring program for wetlands in San Francisco Bay, and that they are also including restoration projects and looking at how you can streamline, or actually, let's flip-flop that. They're looking at how to streamline the permitting process and attaching monitoring and assessment and improving that along the way. So those conversations are happening, and what we're hoping is that we can extend those conversations into the Delta and take some of the successes that we have with trying to identify much quicker processes for NEPA and Clean Water Act 404 in the Bay and, apply them out here. And just in observations from the presentations that we've seen today, I feel like our first agenda item about Science Enterprise Workshop was telling us that we needed to improve science communication and we need to better connect the Bay and the Delta. And then we have another agenda item that shows us, the Delta Renewed. And I just want to point out how effective SFEI is at science communication and just really encourage the DPIIC group to include them and to incorporate them in our work here. Because if we can look at the restoration projects that are being proposed here with this process-based application and analysis, then we're really going to know if these projects will be sustainable over time and will work over time. And we just have a great leader in the Bay, and I hope we engage them, and I hope we work with them as much as we can around this table, because they really do incredible work.
I don't know about you all, but I'm willing to accept that as a very wonderful conclusion and concluding comments to this. Thank you for your time, your attention. We've thrown a lot at you today, and appreciate your patience. Thank you to Jessica for continuing to organize these meetings and now for the follow-up that will occur. Is there any public comment? Hearing none. Jessica, do you have instructions for what we do next?
No, just again, a big thanks. Thanks for letting me organize everyone. I really appreciate that. We joked about the number of emails coming out of the Science Enterprise Workshop, and there's definitely a lot more work to do, and we really appreciate the brain trust that is organized around this and really all of the efforts. So thank you once again, and we will see you.
Do we have a State of the Bay Delta Science reception?
We do.
Okay. Where is that going to be held?
In the lobby.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. All right. See you out there.
Okay.
Thank
you
you all for coming.